Breaking news at the bombshell of the White House. I believe this is the beginning of the end. I get you. It's really the beginning of the end. Maybe during the walls closing in on him. All the walls closing in on him. The walls closing in on him. Breaking news at the bombshell. One astrologer says this means the beginning of the end for President Donald Trump. Trump will resign. Trump's going to resign. Is this a tipping point? I know we said it over and over. You think this is a tipping point? And over and over. This is a tipping point. And over and over. Breaking news, President Trump off the panel. This is the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the end. Breaking news, bombshell. This is the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end. The walls are closing in. The walls closing in. The walls closing in. Breaking overnight bombshell. It's a very dramatic day, and I think it might be a tipping point. You think this is a tipping point? December 1st, 2017. You can mark it down. This is the day that everything changed. The beginning of the end. Beginning of the end. The beginning of the end. The beginning of the end. The bombshell. Trump president will resign. Another hour, another bombshell. This is a tipping point. Trump's going down. This president could be impeached. Resignation. I don't think this president is going to serve out his term. Mr. Trump will not serve out his term. He will not serve out his term. No way. No how. Breaking news. Absolute bombshell. Donald Trump is out. And it's over. The walls closing in. The walls closing in. This is going to be the Achilles heel. Breaking news tonight. I expect Trump to start this week. Will be watershed. Trump is in trouble. Trump's a terrible man. The walls closing in. The walls are increasingly closing in on him. Tonight the walls closing in. Today changed everything. This is the beginning of the end. The bombshell. He's underwater. He feels the walls closing in. It's the beginning of the end.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities,
the old Paso Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We're extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS4 News produces.
But
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first. Unfortunately, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Hello and welcome to Health Revealed Part 1, where we discuss the statistics and examples of a concept that we introduced called statism and how that relates to the medical field and the world at large, how that may affect our health, how that may affect our society on an individual, collective basis. Every aspect of our society may be at a detriment due to this one cause that we identified last time. So let us expand upon that and show perhaps why. I'm joined here by Stephanie Mo Davis, Leslie Powers, and Scott Gordon. Thank you again for joining me, guys, for this great seminar.
Yeah.
So let's start off by talking about the top cause of unnatural death that we proposed last time. There's actually a term for this called democide, which is also known as the murder of any person or people by a government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder. This was coined by a professor. His name was R.J. Rummel of the University of Hawaii. And he estimates a total democide at around 133 million deaths before the 20th century and 262 million deaths in the 20th century for a total of 395 million deaths. And this does not include the combatants killed in the 350 plus wars between governments since 1800 or the 40 plus million international and Civil War combatant deaths in the 20th century. So there were still statistics that he left out in his work. And there's a lot of other works dedicated to this topic. This is a relatively mainstream phenomenon now if you look it up. But I find it to be quite staggering. These are really high statistics, and some may even call it, the top cause of unnatural death, right? So it is very combative with, what we call heart disease and a lot of other leading causes of death. So what is then statism, and how does that relate to democide? Well, statism, spelled statism, but it's said stateism. It is what gives other human beings the authority or right to rule, as detailed by Larkin Rose in his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. In other words, statism is what creates the state, or government, we may call it. Statism involves people blindly trusting or believing in authority, experts, the science, government spokespeople, etc., without questioning. As a concept of study, it remains largely unknown in modern times by the general public and among academics or researchers. I don't see this term really being discussed. Many people don't know democide either. So that's why we're bringing it to your attention. And so defining statism, well, right from Larkin Rose in his book, you can see the cover on the right side of the screen. He says authority can be summed up as the right to rule. It is not merely the ability to forcibly control others, which to some extent nearly everyone possesses. It is the supposed moral right to forcibly control others. Now, we're going to expand on what that means from this author because we find this to be peculiarly very interesting and very telling for the world that we live in.
So this establishes statism as a moral construct, mental construct rather. And as a mental construct, it's subject to a lot of manipulation and is subject to all of the problems that we associate with the mind, as far as, for example, self-control, the use of the mind, the definitions of words, things like that. All of these are going to interact with a concept out there that is a mental construct. And we're going to see more about how it is constructed.
Yes, and Larkin is calling this the most dangerous superstition, right? So when we understand belief systems, superstitions, what does that mean in relation to authority and democide? Here he's kind of bringing a lot of these concepts together. We have some quotes. He says, the belief in authority, which includes all belief in government, is irrational and self-contradictory. It is contrary to civilization and morality and constitutes the most dangerous, destructive superstition that has ever existed. Rather than being a force for order and justice, the belief in authority is the arch-enemy of humanity. Now, we're going to be sharing a lot of statistics that really show this throughout history and why he's making these very, what can seem like bold claims at first. He says people who consider themselves educated, open-minded, and progressive do not want to think of themselves as the slaves of a master or even the subjects of a ruling class. Because of this, much rationalizing, obfuscating has been done in an attempt to deny the fundamental nature of government as a ruling class. A lot of verbal gymnastics, misleading terminology, and mythology have been manufactured to try to obscure the true relationship between governments and their subjects. So we may even observe throughout history how some of the terminology has changed regarding rulership and different forms of government, and that might give us a better picture as to what he's trying to say here. But like I said, we're going to be expanding on a lot of these concepts, and perhaps we can get down to the understanding, like, why are all these deaths happening? And perhaps it has to do with this superstition that he calls the most dangerous, right?
And I thought it might be helpful to share a definition of the word superstition from
Sure.
the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And it says, a belief or practice resulting from ignorance, fear of the unknown, trust in magic or chance, or a false conception of causation. And I think that is a good definition for this context.
Hmm.
And it also adds a notion maintained despite evidence to the contrary. So it is a mental construct, it is a belief that sustains itself despite the evidence to the contrary. And I think it reminds me of in previous times of history where the king took on a belief or claimed a divine right to rule and justified his acts of aggression and violence on somehow it being divinely authorized.
Mhm. Yes, we can even go back to the history of Sumeria, ancient civilizations, and we see that very commonly, this idea of the divine right. And this is all very mainstream knowledge, right? But I think, this term statism is becoming a modern term where people are starting to really dive deep, like, what does that mean, a divine right? And does those remnants of that old belief system still live today? Do people still have like that within their current belief systems? So, more on this, he says the message here is not that we should try to create a world without authority. Instead, the message is that it would behoove human beings to accept the fact that a world without authority is all that has ever existed, and that mankind would be far better off and people would behave in a far more rational, moral, and civilized manner if that fact were widely understood. So we can think perhaps that no one person has the divine right to rule. No one the person is the authority over anyone else. I mean, you see this picture on the left here of this king, right? He's got all this fancy attire, and people like to dress up. They like to wear all sorts of things, but we might, in many medieval and historic times, associate that with power and that with a position of authority. Whereas someone who maybe isn't dressed as nicely and isn't, in certain seats of power, we wouldn't say they are in power. We wouldn't say they have more rights than us, just for some examples. And so there is a harsh reality of following orders, and this relates to this belief system. He says, to be blunt, the belief in authority serves as a mental crutch for people seeking to escape the responsibility involved with being a thinking human being. It is an attempt to pass off the responsibility for decision-making to someone else, those claiming to have authority. But the attempt to avoid responsibility by just following orders is silly because it requires the person to choose to do what he is told. Even what appears as blind obedience is still the result of the individual choosing to be obedient. Not choosing anything is not possible. Right? And this might bring in the concept of responsibility. Are you responsible for your own actions? Are you thinking about your own actions before you do it? And he says should be self-evident that if thousands of basically good people were all seeing the world as it is, they would not be desperately trying to kill each other. In most cases, the problem is not actual evil or malice, but simply an inability to see things as they are. So it's a very interesting, right, thesis to posit here. Is that maybe people are not, we blame greed, we blame selfishness for all the evils of the world, but maybe there's something else happening. Maybe it's happening in the victims or the people who believe in that selfishness and that greed. Maybe there's few people who have selfishness and greed, and there's a lot of others who are just kind of going along with it or condoning it, and maybe they're contributing to the problem, right? So that's where following orders comes in. I mean, you look at these pictures on the right, and this is not so long ago in history. And look how many people are in these perfectly uniform lines, right? And uniforms as well. I mean, they are all looking relatively the same. We might even say it looks robotic. How perfect, every movement is, how stern and clear it must be. And we have to question, how does this take a toll on an individual's health? And as a society at large, I mean, have we ever really considered this in the medical field? I mean, this is a cause of death. If many people are suppressing their conscience and doing wrong to others, my goodness, what needs to be addressed here?
Hey, Corey, I just want to add briefly, I saw a really great quote yesterday that said, we are all born enlightened, and then we learn doubt. And I think if we talk about statism and we go deeper into the emotional aspects of it, really what we have is a world full of doubt, fear, and self-worth issues, self-value issues. And I think that empowerment or disempowerment is really highly related to how we get to this place, is a worldwide disempowerment.
Mm.
The word ignorance comes to my mind, and the question, why are people not seeing things as they are? And I would ask people to hold that question in your mind as we go through our presentation.
So there's two types of authority we may look at, since Larkin also made this distinction. And here we have some information from Chris Nelson. And he tells us authority to control is about some telling others what to do by giving orders or commands of compliance. Others are expected to comply and obey or face negative consequences for refusing. It's saying your actions are subservient to another's will. They decide what your behavior will be. What you rightfully do with your body or your actions is not yours to decide. The authority decides what you can or can't do with your body. They are claiming ownership of actions that come from your body and hence claiming ownership of your body. Accepting authority to control is to accept being owned by another, to accept being a slave. So that's interesting, right? Introducing this idea of slavery. Now, if anybody's familiar with my own work, I have detailed the history of slavery, including many words from the abolitionists in America, where they say very similar statements to this, as to say that the slave actually has a conscience, that they can be moral, that they can be enlightened and can be empowered, so they don't have to be a slave. It was all part of their effort. And so that history I definitely talk about in my book, Slavery Gone for Good, Black Book Edition. But notice here, that is the one form of authority. Here's the other form that he's mentioning. He says experts, the other form of perceived authority, can give suggestions, recommendations, or make claims of truth. But each individual has to make their own decision as to what they do and discern for themselves if something is true or not. Not simply to do it or believe it to be true because an authority said or wrote it. Even without the authority to control, if you simply accept the word of perceived authorities as truth, then you're in mental slavery in thrall. Now, mental slavery, if you study my works as well, I detail that as being like the root form of slavery to all forms. And many historians and philosophers have even coined this, such as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and even Bob Marley, all talking about mental slavery. Even Carl Jung will even get into that. But people in the medical profession have even talked about this idea of slavery. And to us, I mean, I find it quite shocking. So let's go into some of the statistics part of this where we kind of show, well, has there been any experiments? Has there been any studies done on this behavior, on this belief system? One that may come to mind is the Stanley Milgram experiment. And Stanley Milgram, he was a psychologist who conducted a study in the 1960s to study the obedience to authority figures. So exactly what we're looking at here. Participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person who was actually a Confederate when they answered questions incorrectly. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer, and the Confederate eventually began to scream and beg for the experiment to stop. Despite this, many participants continued to administer the shocks when instructed to do so by the experimenter, right? Because this experimenter, the instructor, is said to be this authority figure. So the person who's giving the shocks is like following orders, giving away their responsibility, saying, oh, well, I didn't do it. He just told me to do it. And you can look, I made a whole video compilation. It's about an hour long with the study that has been repeated all throughout the world with similar results, where they show that people are willing to suppress their conscience because they perceive an authority figure to be above that of their conscience. And where they laugh nervously. They have a hard time confronting the fact that they chose to take the action themselves. And so the experiment has been replicated in many countries many times with an estimated 80 to 90% obedience rate. That's staggering. See, Milgram has amazing quotes about this. He wrote a book as well called Obedience to Authority. We also can look at the Stanford prison experiments, right? And this was done by Philip Zimbardo, another psychologist, conducted in 1971 to study the psychological effects of power and authority. Participants were randomly assigned to play the role of either a prisoner or a guard in a simulated prison environment. The guards were given complete control over the prisoners, and the experiment was supposed to last for around 2 weeks. However, the guards quickly became abusive, and the prisoners began to show signs of extreme stress and psychological distress. So the experiment was terminated after only 6 days. So this is a very well-known experiment. A lot of people have studied this because it's like, wow, this was an experiment, but it like gone wrong so quickly. And how come? Like, how come there was such an abuse of power? I mean, the guy who conducted this experiment, he chose individuals that he thought were just average individuals. They were not like criminals or anything to try to be prison guards. He did this experiment not expecting these results. And so there's a lot of talk about this experiment, not so much the Stanley Milgram experiment, but nonetheless very, very relevant for also what we're talking about here.
Yeah, this brings up really interesting possibilities in the hospital setting, as it too is an institution similar to a prison with expected roles. And it would be beneficial to reflect on, are there expected roles between patients, doctors, nurses, all the players in that game? Because we can see that this takes place in a prison, Does it not take place in other institutional settings? And if so, can we learn something from that?
Great point, Scott. And I would just add the school system to that as well.
Yeah. We'll discuss that too, as necessary. How are people attaining this belief system? How are people suppressing their conscience? Maybe we have to look at their foundations, right? If we got to look at the big picture. So we're going to be discussing this in many different angles. The Asch conformity experiment, right, from Solomon Asch, another psychologist. Here you can actually even see a demonstration on the right side of the screen. Which line is the same length as the line on the left? And you have to like pick, well, which one is it? And in an experiment conducted in the 1950s, studied this conformity to group norms, right? So participants were shown a series of lines, just like you see on the screen, and they were asked to identify which one was the same length as a reference line. So, however, the other participants in the study, who were actually Confederates, purposely gave incorrect answers. Many of the real participants also gave incorrect answers in order to conform to the group. So, if you say A is correct with the reference line on the screen there, you would be correct. But, are you saying that because everyone else is saying it? Or are you saying it because you see that to be objectively true through your own eyes, right? There's the question. Are we doing it because we're told to do it, or because there's a lot of pressure, conformity, or are we doing it because of genuine, authentic interest?
And again, we might want to ask what happens to the student who shows up for medical school who has an alternative view or theory or intuition about disease, and he brings these things up? Is he pressured to conform in the same kind of way? Is that part of the set of influences that are working on the healthcare system?
Here you have the Tuskegee study. Whistleblower Peter Buxton, and former employee of the PHS. This is a very shocking one as well. I mean, a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service, okay, in the Centers for Disease Control, so the CDC, on a group of nearly 400 African American men without their informed consent, leading more than 100 to their death. So this is directly from the government, right? The authority figures, where they're actually creating evil. And this whole study was done aimed to observe the natural progression of syphilis in untreated individuals. And the participants were not informed that they had syphilis or given proper treatment for it. There was not consent in this process. And when we're mentioning consent, this is why it seems so problematic. I mean, now there's a lot of movements too in the medical field for like making sure things are done by consent. But how much do we apply that to a lot of things in our society? This idea of consent, how does that relate to authority and statism and democide? When an individual is suppressing their conscience, they're still choosing an action. Are they really giving their consent? Right? Consent is perhaps one of the key terms that we might see in this presentation.
I'll just share a little bit of a summary of some themes I see among these studies. And this is about how the use of authority can create a power differential that then exploits an individual's sense that they're less than in some way, or they don't have the knowledge, right? An abuse of knowledge to exploit an individual's insecurities, their sense of self-doubt, to promote fear or create emotional distress, knock someone out of their thinking mind, right? And so we have in all these examples, the ultimate, self-doubt or insecurity of an individual, and individuals who start to question their own perceptions and have an ultimate lack of self-knowledge and ability to really discern truth because of the emotional disruption of the coercive or fear creating strategies of a person who's claiming authority, right? The confusion of the mind that results.
Yeah, like why is there no informed consent here, right? Like what is going on here? Are there pressures? Are there, order following going on? What's going on that's preventing people from being informed about their own decision making?
Or standing up to become more informed. There's a certain,
Mhm.
blanket trust demonstrated here. And if we're looking at the racial aspects of it, you might wonder if these individuals had a background element of fear or being subjugated, in some way to these authority figures and what they're doing under the name of helping, right?
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
another facet, just to quickly add in to what you both have said, which is excellent, is that when we look at statism and we look at system health and individual sovereignty, that we have to also really understand the dynamic of the relationship as well as what's going on in the individual mind of both sides. So there's also a really profound dynamic and relationship that occurs, which really can't be understood unless you begin to truly delayer the individual.
Mm.
Right. And I wanted to add that something like this is outrageous to us, looking back on it. And yet we want to know, has it been addressed? Has it been corrected? This reveals an ideological or political intrusion into the safety of the Hippocratic Oath, the do no harm, the informed consent. So this would be something very important to examine in looking at the present state of healthcare.
Here's another one. This is mainstream as well. Project MK Ultra, a top secret CIA project in which the agency conducted hundreds of clandestine experiments, sometimes on unwitting U.S. citizens. So again, and I bolded certain colors on purpose to emphasize, is there consent here? Unwitting U.S. citizens to assess the potential use of LSD and other drugs for mind control, information gathering, and psychological torture. This study was inspired by Nazi experimentation, and its 1,600 plus scientists and leaders who came over to work for the US government from Operation Paperclip. So, this is crazy, but believe it or not, I mean, you had people from these countries that we considered to be tyrannies, dictatorships, come over and actually be a part of the so-called free countries of the world and actually conduct experiments on the citizens, much like they did in their own country, and leading to a lot of problems. And then there's a lot of people, even celebrities, who claim to be have been mind controlled from this project to this day. There's a lot that came from this, and now a lot of people have dug up quite a bit on this project.
There's an inherent view in these experiments that of some people having more or less rights than others, right? And choosing to act upon other people who are perceived as lesser, a lesser class, or even subhuman in some way. One has to have that mental switch turned in order to do this to other people.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like a picture of a child too. I mean, it's like, goodness gracious. I mean, they can't make up their own mind even if they wanted to, right? Like it's just crazy what we're willing to do to our fellow man without recognizing like this is a sovereign individual. This is somebody who has their own body, their own ownership. Like, right? Do we have that concept? Do we know what it is? And here's another one, Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide mixture used by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1971. It was primarily employed to defoliate forest and destroy crops, depriving enemy forces of cover and food sources. Approximately 50 million liters of Agent Orange were sprayed over Vietnam, causing widespread environmental damage and severe health effects. The chemical has been linked to various cancers, birth defects, and other serious health issues affecting millions of Vietnamese civilians, U.S. veterans, and their descendants, which continues today. Wild. I mean, and like who developed these chemicals, right? You start looking at that, it's like, wow, some of the pharmaceutical companies that maybe, are still around today. And it's like, why, like Leslie mentioned, why are these people that we call the US military, they're just people like us. But what makes it so that they can do something like this? Are they really thinking for themselves when they do it? Like, what's going on here? Like, would they poison their own land? I mean, do they even know these people that they're poisoning? Like, what's going to happen too when you destroy those crops and those food sources? Those people that live there are going to be more scarce, more in fear, and going to want more war. I mean, this is wild. But this is just one example in history, that we're looking at here.
And I just want to highlight the vulnerability of children because children are 100% dependent upon the adults in their world to protect them. And children are very trusting by nature and don't have the knowledge to fully grasp and understand these advanced concepts that full-grown human beings have the potential to grasp. So children are ultimately victims of all of this.
It's almost the attack on the innocence and connection to consciousness and source that we're born into here on the planet. And they have discovered that if they can disconnect you from the innocence of your divine connection and your soul, they own your mind.
Wow. Well, you as the viewer, you can think for yourself on this. I mean, we're showing many examples here in history. The FDA milk raids that are still happening to this day. In 2010, the US FDA conducted a series of raids on Amish farms in Pennsylvania that were selling raw milk. The FDA claimed that raw milk was unsafe and that the farmers were violating federal law by selling it. The raids resulted in the confiscation of thousands of dollars worth of milk and cheese, as well as the destruction of equipment and the arrest of one farmer. Now, again, that's just like one example in 2010, but you can look up dozens of news stories that keep happening to this day where farmers are being coerced like this. For selling something, right, which is a voluntary action, selling something that you have to another individual. There's no violence in that scenario. There's no involuntary compliance. There's nobody claiming authority over anyone else. But you do see it with the FDA coming in here saying they have the authority to overrule this property, to decide what happens to that property, decide what happens to that farmer and that product, and what happens with the transaction between the person who wants the product and the person who's giving it. I mean, is that the world we want to live in? Is there, just ask yourself that question. Like, is that ethical? Like we're in the medical profession. We're asking like what's going to benefit people? Why are people consuming raw milk in the first place? Is that a personal health choice? Right? Just getting curious here.
And I'll just add that I think that many people will blindly, in a sense, trust the authorities to make good decisions about what is safe and what is not for consumption. Now, raw milk is consumed by many, many people very safely. And in the state I live in, it's legal. And these farmers who sell it are not being raided. But in other states, it's deemed illegal and unsafe. So it's these decisions by the authorities, the statist entities, are not necessarily based on actual truth. They're based on something else. So we need to realize that. And again, use your own discernment rather than blindly trust the decisions of a governmental agency.
Yes. It can seem to me to be quite arbitrary, considering the fact I'm in Florida and it is considered illegal here. So it says for pet consumption only. But there's an awful lot of pets who want this because they're constantly sold out at the different markets I go to. And it is clear that it's not just pets consuming it, right? There's human beings. And it raises a lot of questions like lettuce and these other, forms of food can be contaminated with a bunch of different things, right? So what makes one better than the other? I mean, sometimes somebody might have to make some arbitrary line and say, well, I think this one's worse than another, but there is contamination that can happen to a lot of our food supply. And there's still raw cheeses being sold in the store. There's raw kefir. There's other forms of raw products. So what makes this one raw product worse than another? See, it's like you start asking questions like that. It's like, who really is making up these rules? Who gets to decide?
I just want to add real quick, just to simplify it, is we've all seen outbreaks of salmonella in spinach or something like that. And, it may be that they find or are able to connect 3 cases of salmonella poisoning in a particular area, and then they broadcast it and they amplify it, and the media gets involved. And the next thing you know, we have an entire country or beyond not eating a product because of a danger that has occurred to a few people. And I think at some point, this reminds me of being a parent and being, how much do you smother your child with your own fear of what could happen to them as they evolve? At some point, it just seems like you cannot and you should not be helicopter parenting every single person with every little thing that happens. I think we've gone to this extreme, and the balance is just very off.
Yeah.
That's a great observation, Stephanie. And I've seen that dynamic in multiple areas of life, whether, generally, for example, with community care licensing in a, let's say, a foster care agency,
Right.
if one child, has an accident and they, drown in 2 inches of water, all of a sudden that
Exactly.
is having any body of water is banned and deemed wrong, to have at your house, right?
Wow.
So these exaggerations and extremes.
Right. There's got to be a term for that because it happens all over in every system, in every relationship.
Yeah. Well, one term that comes to mind is collectivism, right? Which we can talk about as well, but there's a lot of isms and ologies and philosophies people have made because of these psychologies that we're ultimately studying here that's going on in people's minds. Like, why are people thinking this is okay to do? So here's another example, and this one, a lot of people didn't know about till later on. A lot of things that happen throughout history, people don't learn about till later on when things start to come out, and people say, "Wait, that happened?" Right? So here you have Japanese internment camps during World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government forcibly relocated and incarcerated approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, in internment camps across the country. This action, authorized by Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942, was driven by fear, racial prejudice, and unfounded suspicions of espionage rather than any concrete evidence of disloyalty. Families were given only days to sell their possessions and report to temporary assembly centers before being transported to one of 10 permanent relocation centers in remote areas of 7 Western states. Living conditions in these camps were harsh, with families housed in Spartan barracks, subject to communal living, and surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire fences. Is this good for health for these individuals? Yet we're claiming to protect them, or the citizens that are not them? Are we separating people again based on some, arbitrary idea of like, well, this person has a certain skin color, or this person has more rights or less rights? Where are these concepts coming from, and what gives this president the authority to decide the fate for other people's lives?
And I just encourage people to take note of this picture, their children looking at us through that barbed wire fence. And you can look at their faces and ask yourself, what is their perception of what's happening?
Yeah.
How are they making sense of this? And how does it affect their sense of self?
I will want to say that, throughout history, when some of these things happen, some of the people who are relocated and taken care of are even happy because the media and the orders are convincing them that they should do it, or that it's for the betterment of them, and that, they'll be housed and taken care of. So they don't have to be responsible of their other stuff at home. They don't have to be responsible for themselves because someone else will be responsible for them. So there's even cases, stories of Holocaust survivors where they say, I actually enjoyed it at this camp. And I mean, there are stories like this that exist out there. Believe it or not, there are. And so, people look at a lot of the bad side of things, and this is also bad too, because there's some folks who are willingly going along with it, but not considering their fellow man who doesn't want to go along with it, right?
In a sense, there's a great unfairness of the reality that we're actually born into. It's almost as though we are born into innocence. So we want to trust. We want to hope that the people who have authority over us are actually good people. And it's almost like an inverted scenario is that, we are good people at the core of our nature as human beings. And I think we're just very unaware of the actual reality that we live in.
If you perceive that the authorities are doing these actions, this incarceration, so to speak, and calling it protection, and presenting a story that this is for your own good, people seem to tolerate a lot of violation of their rights and freedom because of the belief in that authority. And so again, that creates a vulnerability to be abused or exploited if that authority is, their intentions aren't pure, and if it doesn't come from real care, but instead from the desire to have power. And that brings us back to those experiments like the prison experiment, where there is a tendency in some people through their own internal wounding to gravitate towards the feeling of power as opposed to the feeling of care. So.
Leslie, I just want to add real quick to what you said. The incredible mental confusion that can occur when somebody actually does begin to wake up, they can then polarize in the other direction, whereas now I no longer trust anybody. So it becomes very mentally confusing because not every person who works in government or every police officer is actually doing evil. So the mind can get so scrambled. And I truly believe, as will go on in this presentation, is that the development of the psyche to be able to learn to discern is, I think, what's being asked of every individual in this time and as we move forward.
Absolutely. Yes, we need to clear up those sort of what can seem like gray areas right now. It's like, wait, if we're saying that, there's this belief in authority, well, what about the good authority? What about the police who are protecting us, actually doing, their job, we say, right? So we're going to delve into those concepts as well. Thank you, Stephanie, for mentioning that.
And one thing I'd like to add to that is that, this is a solution that the governments have implemented for problems of the past, for whatever. Oftentimes it's a healthcare problem. It's a pandemic. Even in World War II, a lot of the justifications for the camps were isolating from the community threats to health. Those were justifications given. So why isn't it seen more broadly how archaic such a solution would be? And yet these solutions were proposed for our most recent pandemics and possible future pandemics. So that's something we want to keep in mind too when we're looking at the overall health care of the population.
Yeah. Whether we want to admit it or not, the state plays a very big role in medicine, right? I mean, there's, again, regulation and telling people what medicines are right or not. We discussed some of that before. And here you have the Willowbrook hepatitis study, a study that was conducted between 1956 and 1970 on mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York. The study aimed to investigate the transmission of hepatitis, and the children were deliberately infected with the virus without their informed consent, right? So another unethical study. We call it unethical. Why? It's because there wasn't consent, and there's these kids, and these people who are being manipulated against their will, perhaps even deceived, right? And is that right? Is that right to happen? Why does it happen? Is there order followers? Most likely. Whether it's the person being manipulated or the person who's carrying out the order to manipulate. Or even it could be the person who says they're in charge because they have somebody else that they perceive is in charge of them. and they too are suppressing their conscience.
Some people will justify these actions under the guise of for the greater good, right? And that is a statement and a justification that really needs questioning, because who gets to decide that? So who gets to play God, so to speak, in deciding whose consent is not required, and who is not meaningful enough as an individual to put their lives in jeopardy because of an experiment or an action. And I think that Scott bringing up our recent events is really relevant and important, because there were actions that were being justified, action to remove the need for informed consent, that was denied in the talk of greater good or benefit to all. And that is a very questionable practice and can lead to these types of devastations.
Yeah, I'd like to add just really quickly, The Denial of Death is a book written by Ernest Becker. And basically, the theory is that we all are living in a state of death anxiety. And you're easily manipulated by what you just mentioned, Leslie and Scott and Corey, to make, for your own good type of behaviors. If you are living with a constant state of death anxiety, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, which we all must face as human beings, especially adult human beings, that death is a part of life. But you live in that constant state of death anxiety, you're going to be much easier to manipulate.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And so as you can see, there's different layers to this, and we're going to map it out for you guys too with a lot of charts as well. Here you have the Holmesburg prison experiment. And these are infamous experiments. These are all mainstream. A study conducted between 1951 and 1974 at the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The study aimed to test various chemicals and drugs on prisoners, including skin irritants, radiation, and dioxin. The prisoners were not informed of the risks involved, and many suffered from severe burns, rashes, and other health problems as a result of the experiments. You see it here again, this idea of non-consent among all these unethical experiments. We have the monster study. A study was conducted in 1939 at the University of Iowa on 22 orphan children. The study aimed to investigate the effects of negative speech therapy on children's speech patterns. The children were divided into two groups, one of which was subjected to negative speech therapy and the other was not. The children who received negative speech therapy suffered from psychological trauma and speech problems that persisted into adulthood. So, I mean, it's bad enough we're experimenting on children, but let's ask, can this even happen to adults? Really, are we considering what we're doing here? Again, is it just because it's a study for the greater good for everybody? Like we need to do it, so we do it. What justifications are we creating to do these actions?
Something I've often asked myself as well with some of these studies and some of the things that we continue to do is, do perceived authority figures that are participating in these sorts of studies have some sort of knowledge, whether it be ridiculous knowledge or information? Like, why? What is the real why of why we're testing negative speech theory on children? Like, I want to know if are you in the know of something that we as the general public do not know about? Is this your own craziness and delusions being projected onto the public? What really is going on? Either way, it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I will say that I believe for the most part that there have been enough activism in research to stop using humans and animals as research subjects in a lot of these cases. But it's still happening in, I think, outside of the research realm. And let's be wary of that, of how the government itself is in some ways doing experiments on the general population by using experimental substances or drugs and things like that, bypassing safety protocols and processes that were designed to prevent these types of wrongdoings or harm being done to people.
Yeah. I was at the University of South Florida the other day and I saw people with shirts. They all had shirts and it says, "We love consent." And I said to them, "I love consent too, but how much do you love consent?" Right? Because just as you proposed, Leslie, I'm afraid that people are not necessarily applying consent to all their actions in this life. And I would challenge those medical researchers out there that say, yeah, everything should be ethical when it comes to research. Why wouldn't everything be ethical when it comes to everything else? Are there problems with consent that are so obvious right in front of our face that we aren't looking at outside of the medical field? Does that not affect the health of people? Like, isn't that the whole point of why we do it? Right? So it's just a question. The Fernald school radiation experiment, a study was conducted between 1946 and 1956 at the Fernald School in Waltham, Massachusetts. The study aimed to investigate the effects of radioactive isotopes on the human body. Mentally disabled children at the school were fed cereal containing radioactive isotopes without their informed consent. Many of the children suffered from severe health problems as a result of the experiments.
Hey, Corey, real quick, I just want to say, if you start to really pay attention to the meta aspect of all of these studies that have been done over time and where we're at today, there is oddly some strange links. And just really considering over time, have things been being linked over time, over lifetimes for some sort of particular agenda? And I think especially now, which I know we're going to get into the presentation shortly, the deeper aspects of the psychology. But Leslie, you mentioned we've come to enough knowledge to not do a lot of these studies on human beings. But what we have become experts at in many different dimensions is taking the overt and making it covert, and really finding strategic other mechanisms to do similar sorts of studies and behaviors. So that makes it even more difficult, because now it's just not overt evil being played out. Now we're really deep in the depths of the mind, and to have the ability to see where we're covertly manipulating and actually acting out very similar behaviors.
Our role is to reveal it, right? Or health revealed. And so that's what we're doing here. And there's many more unethical experiments. I'm not going to go through all of them, but here's just some on the screen, right? And some that, we kind of briefly mentioned as well. But mustard gas experiments in World War II, and many people relate that as well to some of the medical technology we have today. Skid Row cancer study, all these others. I mean, you can do research on this for a long time, but the point is to see some of these patterns that we're recognizing here. And also the order followers and the people who are going along with these experiments, we're asking the question, why? Right? So do the order followers who actually carry out the actions deserve any blame or responsibility? Because often when people discuss these experiments, and I've seen many people talk about different experiments, they're not asking this question, which I find to be quite an obvious question. They say, oh, this experiment happened, it was bad, and we shouldn't do that experiment again. Yeah, but what type of experiment? Like what happened in the experiment? What actually was going on in the minds of the people who were conducting that experiment? People don't get to that point.
In relation to healthcare, and I know Leslie, you would understand this well, we all have discussed this, is this concept of it's easier to blame the person that has the perceived power. But very often the corruption happens at multiple layers, even downstream. And in healthcare right now, you do see a lot of disgruntled individuals regarding the middlemen. And this is kind of what I foresee in the order followers. If you are a disempowered individual and you're getting orders from the top, you will take on that same overt or covert obstruction of someone else over someone else's autonomy, because now you have a little bit of a taste of power, even if it's not the CEO of a company, because you're getting a little taste. You're going to want that because you can't self-source that on your own. To me, that reminds me of the order followers. It's like they're the middlemen.
And many of these experiments are government run, designed and run experiments. So there was some questions that the government wanted answers to about people and their behavior and their impact on them of various substances or pressures or so forth. So why is the government doing these studies? What is the intent of that? And a lot of it is done very secretly as well. The other thing is that the order following in the government is very clearly created, right? The ways that the military is trained to follow orders. That is, kind of what makes a good soldier. And so we can see the mechanisms of creating an order follower.
Yeah,
Yes.
those dynamic are also played out within healthcare. We've talked about this. Is I've talked to many doctors who have said to me openly that when med students start college, they're bright, hopeful, energetic, good intended, and really, they feel like they're following their calling. And at some point, it seems like they disconnect from the soul. And you hear many people who come through medical training and they'll say, oh, it was like fighting a war. I was in battle. It's a very militaristic. So this militaristic style of training on any system level has to be really addressed.
Yeah, look at the sleep deprivation of residents in hospital system. There's a lot of similarities in the way that, these similarities to a soldier, in basic training. Right?
There's this idea that we must break somebody down to their very essence in order for them to be good, perceivably, at what they're doing. I mean, even just very, very relevant to the time is P. Diddy and things going on within Hollywood and the music industry, is that there's these covert forms of abuse happening, sodomy, etc. But because I'm going to cause that person trauma, they're eventually going to attain a higher level of, awareness or success or whatever that Luciferian mindset is, where we need to destruct somebody in order for them to somehow realize something. Has to be, we have to do it a healthier way.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe the goal is less about enlightenment or awareness as it is about compliance and doing, the bidding of a agenda of some sort, something to contemplate.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in addressing that final question on the page there, as humanity and in our international dealings, international law, through the Nuremberg laws, for example, we've recognized that the order follower does carry responsibility and does need to be aware. Even in the military, they're trained under international law that they're not to follow an illegal order. And so as humankind, it seems that we do recognize that the order follower must take a position of responsibility, must say no. And yet at the same time, culturally, there are all kinds of forces acting against that. And it can be extremely confusing for a medical student or a medical professional or anyone in many different areas to discern, what their responsibility is. But I think one of the things that we can demonstrate when we get into the laws and when things like Larkin in his book, Larkin Rose in his book that we're going to revisit, lays out the logic of this. Yes, there is responsibility and blame for somebody who carries out an order against what they know to be correct and true. So we'll see some more of that.
And we'll ask you questions too.
Yeah, and I would also, look at the catch-22 that individuals are in with trying to preserve their own security, their economic livelihood, and that when that is being threatened, then people are going to be propelled into a sense of fear and do what it takes to often preserve, often will do what it takes to preserve their own security at the expense of the order following, even if it's a questionable decision.
There's just such an incredible amount of cognitive dissonance and fracturing of the psyche throughout this process. Having a holistic worldview where we actually were promoting health on these multitude of levels wouldn't require the fracturing of the psyche and then the putting back together after we get the training or what have you. So that seems to be what we're doing now, is we're creating an immense amount of cognitive dissonance. We're fracturing the psyche through these trainings, through these things, and then we're never really putting people back together appropriately. And then we're living out these wounded parts, projecting it out onto other beings. And, as we'll get into, it's, I think, a major reason as to why we are where we are today in our exceptional amounts of mental health crises and chronic health diseases and et cetera.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great point, because psychologically, a broken person, for lack of their own integrity, will begin to dramatize or act out the things that were done to them, or the things that they saw happen that they were not able to do anything about. And then that's a completely broken person and broken society when that happens to any large degree.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I must say, I interviewed many veterans. I've talked to many veterans, and they say these things that you guys are mentioning. I fought in the war. I thought I was doing good at first, and then I got out and I have all this trauma, and then they commit suicide. They have high depression rates. It's concerning, right? We're looking at health. What about these individuals?
Same with healthcare, Corey.
Yeah.
I've talked to many patients who say, I followed orders to a T. I did everything I was told to do, and I didn't get better. In fact, I got worse.
Wow. Look at that.
So,
It's incredible what we're highlighting here, and it's why, we think this information is perhaps so important. I don't see this being talked about in many places, especially as root targeting as we're getting here, identifying what is that belief system that's responsible for a lot of this. Statism and Democide, introducing these concepts, starting to really say, like, yeah, there's people who have studied this before. There's people who have looked at this. These people are not aware of that material. So we're revealing it for everybody, such as this model here, the Duluth model of power and control. And, I encourage you, just take a moment if you want and look over these charts, right? You have one end, which is violence, and the other end, which is non-violence. So, what constitutes violence? There's coercion, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, denying, blaming, minimizing, using children, using privilege, economic abuse. And then nonviolence is economic partnership, shared responsibility, negotiation and fairness, non-threatening behavior, respect, trust and support, honest and accountability, and responsible parenting. And I encourage you, because we mentioned this before, to recognize that some of the aspects on the right side may be even used for the left side here. People, in their trust, in their honesty, in their fairness, these concepts may be used against them to control them, because, hey, I'm on your side. I'm with you. I agree with you, to try to get your vote, to try to get, you on their side, so they can further, continue their authority, their position of power and control over you. They have to have some level of mixing some truth and lies in order for it to be at all any appealing to people. Because if it was outright violent or outright evil, nobody would go along with it. There has to be some sort of cloak or deception in order for that violence to be permitted. Right? Because if you show anybody these charts, they'd say, yeah, that makes sense, probably.
And I'll just add that this dynamic of power and control in relationship occurs at all levels of relationship. So these charts were created in the context of domestic violence. And yes, it uses gender-specific terms, which we can look past to see that regardless of male or female, that these are patterns of power and control that exist not only between individuals, but also in the relationship of individuals with authority. our individual's relationship to their employer, to their government, so to speak. And we can see how entities exploit this power and control to get compliance, and the underlying motivations, are questionable.
If you are even remotely aware of this, you'll see how easy it is to abuse your power and manipulate somebody with their own victim consciousness and their own pain points. It's not difficult. Any one of us are capable of doing that, which we wouldn't want to do. But what seems to have happened, Corey, as you were saying, is that a lot of people that are in control and are holding the power are using this covert manipulation tactic to hit on people's pain points and to just offer them a sliver of that power back or finances back, or hit on a pain point that happened generations ago. And if that person feels like they're going to receive something from that because there's depletion within themselves somewhere, they're going to grab it. And this is how the authority seems to be running a lot of the operations that we have going today, which is wrong.
Yeah.
And
Those are great points. And if anyone went into shock over some of the previous slides that we saw and were wondering why, and look here at this chart, there's a lot of answers here. I mean, those that don't have our best interests at heart have a great many tools at their disposal to influence that conduct. And sometimes our own psychology contributes to that. So these are very valuable references for as answering the question, why? How could that happen under rule of law in a modern civilization?
And I just wanted to add how many of these strategies on the power and control wheel are used in raising children. How are coercion and threats normalized in parenting or in the school system? How is using intimidation normalized as a way of getting children to comply? Using isolation, timeouts, standing in the corner. How are we using our children as the for the creation of these dynamics perpetuated into adult behavior?
Yes.
It is in my hope that this is a dying paradigm. And I know a lot of people are coming to conscious awareness about how things have been operating and what we've been doing in our own unconscious nature. When I was younger, my parents were doing some of these things to me. I was unaware. I just thought that's how it was done. But fortunately, I'm praying that we're in a dying paradigm and we're going to have more people with the conscious awareness to step forward to create alternative solutions. So,
yeah. And I'm afraid to say that, again, in the medical community, they look at these and they say, this is violence, this is nonviolence. They're not looking at all the nuances and the things that we're mentioning here. But that's why we're here to reveal that to you folks here. And you can kind of get that holistic picture. And we'll dive deep into the schooling and the different aspects so you can get some solutions and different perspectives that aren't being shared as well. Here's the hierarchy of needs chart. If you're unfamiliar with this, it's important to just be familiar with it. That's why we share it here. And, we figured people would like charts. So here you have Abraham Maslow, and we're going to be revisiting his work as well throughout this. But you can see psychological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization, and then self-transcendence, right? And it's interesting to me, too, that when you're talking about, transcendence or spirituality and truth, spirit, consciousness, it starts to delve into the realm of, well, like, what is that? It can't be scientifically measured. And, that's not health. Like, I need to know what I need to do with my client right now, like one-on-one. This seems too out there, right? Like, I can't understand that. But, here you have a lot of people, and we'll discuss this too as you go on. You'll see a lot of researchers and people who have clients who have helped a lot of people sharing how that can actually be a very helpful modality. And so, think about that as time moves on. It's like, interesting, if that's our goal, but we don't understand it, maybe that's part of the reason why we don't have it.
it's very difficult in the systems that we have today that incentivizes everything being measured. And I'm not saying that things should not be measured, they should, but in reality, there's a lot of incentives for healing and health that just cannot be measured. And we have to be okay from living from a place that honors both sides of that coin. Love can't be measured. There's a lot of things that just cannot be measured. And we have to accept that that's a part of the new paradigm.
Yeah, and we'll discuss that too, what we mean by that. Many prominent researchers have talked about this.
I think this chart also points out how people's basic needs can be manipulated and how people can be manipulated by manipulating these needs, right? A
Yes.
need to breathe clearly, a need for food, a shelter, that people's natural desire for love, friendship, and intimacy. These are powerful motivations. And if people aren't fully aware of the context of which they're following their path to fulfill those needs towards the bottom of this pyramid, they may be missing out on some of the higher level, qualities of morality, creativity, spontaneity, etc.
Yes. Something I would like to mention as well is some of the bloodiest wars in history were done under the pretense of good and morality and righteousness and spirituality. So this sort of like, really looking at the top of this chart here, the reason why people have such a devotion to their cause, willing to kill their fellow man, go on a crusade or a jihad, for example, in history, is because they so firmly believe what they know, because that's like at the top of their pyramid for them. Whereas if somebody was just fighting for water or for food, do you think they're going to create as bloody as a war as they would for a righteous cause where they believe somebody is wrong just by the nature of their belief system? This is something that, Alan Watts has talked about. It's like the bloodiest wars in history have always been done under the name of righteousness. So just something to think about.
Yeah. Corey, can I quickly read a quote?
Yeah, please.
By Gabor Mate, who we're going to talk about later on in this
Yes.
presentation when we get into the psychology more. The research literature has identified 3 factors that universally lead to stress: uncertainty, the lack of information, and the loss of control. Chronic illness encompasses all 3. So you can very much see when you're in that bottom tier of uncertainty, lack of information, and fear, you're not going to be doing some of the things you just mentioned, like war. And unfortunately and sadly, it seems like that's where they're trying to keep us in that lower nature, lack of certainty, fear.
Right. And this is where permaculture and solutions that aren't really taught about can really help create abundance among people to help them be more self-reliant, self-sufficient. And then if they have that and they're obligated to be a part of the community and they're obligated to be responsible, are they free? Right. And not obligated forcibly, of course, but obligated naturally in a sense that the community supports it and it's something that, they want to be a part of, and so these are questions. It's like, well, how can we get that? And haven't we struggled with that throughout history? Yes, we have. So we're detailing these patterns and we're building up these premises so you can help see like what is this bigger picture that we're dealing with in health and society. I mean, all these things, right? Health means whole, so we're looking at everything. What comprises of a human being and their motivations. I mean, we say we're the freest country on earth in America, but a lot of those studies we shared before were done in America, right? So what irony is that? Nonetheless, on children. Goodness.
And you might ask yourself, where are you vulnerable as an individual in any one of these areas of needs? Where are you a little desperate, a little scared, or a lot? Where you might be willing to compromise something you wouldn't ordinarily compromise if you felt secure.
And here we have the locus of control. Leslie, if you want to expand on this, you may, by Julius Rotter, a psychologist.
Yes, so the locus of control is a psychological concept developed by Julian B. Rotter that refers to the degree to which individuals believe they control situations, experiences, and outcomes in their lives. In education, the concept generally refers to how students view the causes of their academic success or failure. So an external locus of control has the general mindset that things happen to me. Outcomes are out of my control. I need to seek reassurance from others before acting. I'm just, little old me, and I can't do anything about that. I'm just going to work in my own little bubble here, versus an internal locus of control, which has the mindset of, well, I make things happen. I can and do control outcomes, and I don't need to seek reassurance from others before acting. Now, if you have a predominantly external locus of control, you're more likely to conform and obey the societal or cultural influences, more likely to obey authority. If you are leaning towards the internal locus of control, then you are less likely to conform or obey social influences and more likely to be thinking for yourself, and also seeing possibilities and be motivated to take action to achieve goals. Now, clearly, we also need to have a reality base where we do recognize what is within our power to impact and what is not. We don't want to be delusional, right? And go to an extreme of thinking we are God and that we can change the outcomes of everything, right? That is a dangerous place to be. But on the other hand, if you are extreme on the external locus of control, then you are passive and you are basically allowing others to determine your fate.
This reminds me a lot of something that Scott said to me when I first met him, I don't know, several years ago now, which was this concept of reach and withdrawal. And to me, in my mind, it also reminds me of some of the other mapping we went over in regards to the masculine and feminine. And external action-oriented processes, learning from those processes and then redoing them, like getting into this loop, as opposed to are we doing adequate inner work to be able to experiment without as many redos and redos and redos. So it feels to me like you were saying, Leslie, that both of these aspects are important. But you have to be aware of the repercussions. If you are just externally focused, you might have to redo and redo and redo, and you might hurt a lot of people within the context of that type of situation, which we see has happened. So I think societally, we need to value a little bit more of the internal locus of control, do a little bit of our own inner work, and start to find where we're imbalanced. So then when we do externalize, we're doing it from a more balanced perspective.
I would say the internal locus of control leans more towards personal responsibility, the spirit of taking responsibility for your situation and finding out what do you have control over to influence this the milieu, the environment with which you're in.
Right. Yeah. All right. And then moving on here, and thank you guys. That was really, I think, very insightful. And I like how you connected a lot of the concepts previously. Thank you for doing that. Here we are connecting, authority and the locus of control. So statism promotes an external locus of control and profits off of people's lack of self-trust. Empowering information is withheld to keep people trapped in perceived powerlessness. Time and energy must be made for self-awareness, right? So as Leslie said, like that that internal locus of control, that's what's going to perhaps help us understand that statism, we aren't having to be an order follower. We don't have to follow an authority figure telling us how to live our own lives. We can kind of develop that authority within ourselves. But at the same time, going back to the masculine and feminine, we don't want to be all about ourselves. And then, we aren't really thinking about others, because is that really freedom? If you have freedom for yourself, but others don't have freedom, it's not freedom for all. So is it freedom at all? Right?
Corey, the divine mother in me, that feminine, wants to really just express my heart. How many more lifetimes? How many more people have to die?
Yeah.
before we start to become self-aware and start to lead more with love. Like, how much longer are we going to do this? The warring, the deaths, the killings, the harming of children. How long do we want to continue to do this?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll say, that this idea of profiting off people's lack of self-trust is a huge issue. And that this point about withholding information is a key part of that, and is happening more and more in the modern world, where we are seeing information being obfuscated or hidden from us, harder to access. And so now, to access information, we need to take more of our time and energy to find it. And our time and energy is a valuable resource, perhaps our most valuable resource. And we are saying that not only do we need to need this time and energy for self-awareness, so that we can see ourselves clearly and be able to guard against the manipulation from external forces, but we also need to more time and energy expended on accessing information and kind of discerning what is true and what is not.
Yes. You can see this chart here. It says things you can control, your thoughts, your actions, your decisions, right? We may even say this is your property, right? It's things that you have ownership over. But then, outside of that are the things you can influence, other people's actions, other people's choices, and the team's response to change. So what are you using for influence, right? Are you using violence on yourself? Are you using violence on others? Right? And then the things you cannot control, the economy, traffic, the weather. But you see how they're all connected in one way or another to each other. But what's the thing that you can control? It's you. It's only you. You can't control everybody else. So if you just understand this dynamic, this chart alone, I think it's very insightful for what we've been talking about.
I'm
I think
going
this
to
is
hit
why
home this concept of time, because I think that the control of our time is one of the biggest strategies to decrease our power in discernment, and also in leading humans to feel powerless. And I'll bring an example from someone I've worked with who's in the medical field, a nurse who was working as a telephone consult nurse, where you call your nurse to get information about your situation to decide what you need to do about it. She was a Spanish speaking nurse, and therefore often needed to spend extra time with her patients that called, and she was very invested in doing quality calls, really listening, translating, and what I learned about that position is that there's a certain, the word quota, there's another term for this, where she had to have so many calls in an hour in order to meet her requirements for her job. And if she spent too much time helping an individual, then her job was in jeopardy. And so it was this very, very upsetting pressure that she felt, where she was put in a position of wanting to do the right thing and caring, but yet actually having to do less, to do a decreased service in order to meet the requirement of the agency, these arbitrary numbers that are being set for her of how many people to talk to in an hour. So there's a manipulation again of this of time, of numbers being put on a professional who's trying to do good, and yet being in these catch-22s and dilemmas and having to make decisions. Do you do the right thing, or do you do the thing that's going to keep you employed?
this happens at many tiers of the medical system. I know many doctors who say the same thing within their clinic. Did you hit this target? Did you hit this target? Did you see this? Did you see this? So this goes high on the layers of control within many systems. I can't think of any system who doesn't have this sort of incentivization to do more for less and to care less, which is a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so self-awareness, are we spending our time, our attention, our energy on that? How much is that part of our medical practice? How much is it part of just our life, really, across the board? Like even the things we eat, the things we talk about. And are those ideas, those foods, are they coming from others or are they coming from a place local, place from us, from ourselves, from nature, right? Where is it coming from? And that's, I think, this whole locus of control concept is nailing it. It's like, where is it coming from? Whatever that is, the control, the information, all of that.
Hey, Corey, I just want to quickly add for our audience is that, and Leslie, you were stressing the component of time, is that going on a journey, a hero's journey to develop your own self-awareness does take time and energy and perseverance. And the average citizen today, who let's say is a doctor and has two kids at home and has so many responsibilities, that's why I believe that individuals that are doing the work that we're doing, which is aggregating knowledge and helping people to awaken their consciousness and understand what's going on with their mind, is so critical. We can help them. We've spent hours upon hours upon hours doing this work for years upon years, aggregating this information for people to help them become aware with, I don't want to say the least amount of effort, but at least with aggregated resources, I think is going to be exceptionally helpful as we proceed.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you out there for taking the time for this again. And for sharing this too with those, who need that information. I thank you for taking the time to do that and inviting them to also take the time to do that. Thank you. And so Leslie mentioned it. We're going to briefly cover it here, government schooling. And I had my friend David Rodriguez, a school principal and author, share with us information that he has since he was a co-author to John Taylor Gatto, who was a former school teacher, who wrote notorious books on the schooling system. And I encourage that you look into it if you want a lot of information on that topic. Of course, we're not delving super deep into this topic, but we are going over the basic aspects of this that we think are relevant to what we're talking about. And so he says here, quote, government schools were designed to benefit the government, not the individual. Politicians created the government school system despite much public resistance against its creation. Learning is natural and fun, but when it's forced, it ruins the joy and fun. Right? So again, think about this when it comes to other institutions as well. Are we seeing any patterns here? What are state schools doing? Like, why do we have this mentality where we're suppressing our conscience, we're order following, we're imbalanced on different, extremes of different charts that we're showing? Well, schools become the training grounds for the state's agenda, David tells us. Schools reward compliance, not critical thinking. Schools are increasingly becoming more left brain focused and are providing students with fewer opportunities for social, emotional development, creative expression, or physical activities. Schools are becoming more technology based and less interactive in real time.
Hey, Corey, really quick, I wanted to mention when I was living in New York City, I lived right down the street from a Rudolf Steiner school, Waldorf school. These schools, I think I mentioned when we were creating this seminar, some of the people that are highest in actually creative leadership that's going in a right direction are actually graduates of these Waldorf schools and alternative education schools who are able to really amplify the direction that their consciousness is leading them in, rather than being specifically placed just through a randomized, like you said, state-based program.
Yeah, I just want to bring up, how does this mainstream schooling system create a relationship with time? So in mainstream schools, there are bells, loud bells, indicating when a child needs to be in their seat, in their classroom, or they get in trouble in some way. They get a tardy slip, and so many tardy slips leads to punishment, right? So kids are trained very young to get up, sit down according to an external authority, a regimentation that is externally created, right? And so it's a good training for people to acclimate to the idea of a time clock on your job, being told when to start your job, when you get to take a break, when you need to get back. If you've ever worked in assembly line, that's how it operates. That the big bell rings, everybody drops what they're doing, they run off and smoke a cigarette. The bell rings, they come back, right? And so there's this training, in a sense, going on around compliance that we can see how it plays out into the participation in externalization of power. And I would say that there's also a correlation here in how people really lose their ability to manage their own time. So time management being a skill that's really an internally developed discipline. And if you're used to other people telling you how to manage your time, then a lot of people, in my experience of people I've met, really lack the ability and those skills to manage their own time and discipline themselves separate from an external authority.
Yes.
I think it's just clear that we mentioned we're not promoting that children at school don't have a sense of order. We understand that there needs to be some sort of orderly fashion when you have kids. I'd be very interested to learn more about the Waldorf schools and some of the alternative educational systems. How are they doing that time management? But you're right, Leslie, is that we become so conditioned in that it becomes very difficult to manage your own time outside of that as an adult. And then again, it's just very easy to continue to fall in line with that at your 9-to-5 job.
Scott, I'd like to hear from you on this topic as a school teacher.
Well, yeah, I've had quite a bit of experience with public schools, and I've had to sort of personally work around the system to try to alleviate some of those impositions. But yeah, I really don't have that much to add. That's a very good summary.
Great. Yeah, I think when it comes to it mentioning technology, I mean, this is something we'll talk about too, but again, the order follower, the person who's like staying in line, very robotic like. And I just noticed from my experience, being exposed to a lot of technology, it starts to kind of program your mind, to think in fast-paced terms, get those dopamine hits. And I think a lot of that ties into this type of environment, type of structure.
Hey, Corey, really quick, just to highlight something we discussed last presentation. And if any of the audience hasn't seen our last presentation, I encourage you to go back and check it out, is the concept of moving towards the technocratic state and devaluing the principles and processes of that feminine aspect of the creative, the music, the art, the play, the joy, the expression, the process in life, the experiential, the subjective. That's very critical to have a holistic society. So you're right. We seem to be just conditioning the feminine out and replacing it with a technocratic state, which is a state where we all suffer in the end.
Exactly, Stephanie. And there's very little time for self-reflection and reflection on the relational aspects of learning in the modern school system.
And children are very creative. I mean, I'm pretty sure you ask most people, it's like, yeah, children are, they have an amazing imagination. So to give them credit, not to say like they need to be programmed or taught something, perhaps we can learn from them in the aspect that they have something to share with us that we might lose as we get older and, forced into that world of consumerism, materialism, etc., that we might find ourselves in. And so David shares with us that the schooling model we have is based on the Prussian model of schooling by Johann Fichte, who was an influential philosopher who helped create that school system. He shares with us the goal of education. This would be imported into the U.S. by politician Horace Mann in 1852. He says, quote, "Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." Now, if you're familiar with the concept of mental slavery, the idea that, you want to be controlled by another and that you don't need physical slavery, you don't need like whips and chains in order to be enslaved, this ties in quite well, right? You accept your slavery, and therefore you actually make the slave master's job easier, and you make it more deceiving. You make it look as if it isn't slavery at all because you accepted it, right? So, not to make a parallel between education and slavery, but I'm helping you see the underlying psychological foundations here, which, I'm seeing right there, where it's like controlling someone without the use of violence, right? Like how is that done, right? Just ask yourself that question. And a disregard of free thinking. Reverend Frederick T. Gates, business advisor to John D. Rockefeller, who created the General Education Board, said this: "We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians. Nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply."
We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians. Working in the creative arts early out of my education, you realize that there's this common theme of the starving artist, or the artist that has had to suffer greatly to be able to bring out their artistry again. Their artistry always existed. It's just the doubt, the fear, the conditioning out of that being valuable. You see so many artists either hiding, they're very introverted. There's a lot of geniuses who stay very enclosed because it's been cut off from them to be of value, so to speak. So these starving artists, or artists that are out there that are very introverted, they're terrible at expression or articulation, they're struggling to get their genius out. It's because of this indoctrination.
Yeah.
Or they can't ground it enough to even take care of themselves. They don't have the balance between their artistry and their ability to live off their artistry, because they're just, it's been all fractured.
It's a good point. And again, going back to what you said about the right brain versus, the left brain, it's mentioned right here, in a quote where someone's saying we don't want someone to use that feminine right brain aspect, right? And it's like you have to ask yourself the question, well, we don't want this, we don't want that. Like, we don't want innovators, we don't want people expressive. So what do they want? Right? They want perhaps order followers. I mean, and again, I'm not trying to generalize here. Right? When I'm saying this, it's like I'm saying in this particular quote, that's what I'm getting out of this. Because if somebody can't really express themselves and they can't go on to do something great, like who are they? Like someone just to be kept down, like pushed down their potential, their meaning, their value. And that's not what we should do, right? Education should be aimed at making someone more expressive, more find out the value of themselves. So this seems like the exact opposite.
Yeah. I was personally discouraged by a guidance counselor in 11th grade not to go into philosophy when I was asked what I wanted to study in college, and I identified philosophy. And very quickly he told me that was not a good choice. I wouldn't be able to find a job, and changed my mind, right?
Wow.
In my heart, why I feel this is a threat. Why are artists a threat? Why are poets a threat? It's a threat of honest orientation and expression of that which they're experiencing in current reality. And if that goes against what they want, that's a threat, because people who authentically express what the collective consciousness is experiencing, that's a call to action for change and transformation. So the authentic, sacred, feminine principle is about switching up the angles and hearing where we're missing the mark in our current society and collective, and breaking down the ego construct and doing what needs to be done to change an angle on the reality to make it more healthy. So the suppression of that means business as usual, exactly how they want it.
Yeah. And we have a lot on that as well, talking about this idea of art, how influential that can be on people's minds and their health, certainly. It actually can be quite a lot.
Business as usual without questioning authority. Business as usual without challenging current paradigms.
And you know
Yes.
what, Leslie? This is perfect because the majority of the collective feminine wound from that suppression is I don't feel seen, heard, loved, or understood. That's the collective feminine wound that so many of us women carry. We carry this wound, and you can see exactly linking it back to where it's come from is we've
Yes.
been suppressed of our creativity and the force of love as an act of change and transformation. And women today, maybe even you listening to this call, you have that same collective wound of I don't feel heard, nobody's listening to me, I don't feel understood, I feel alone, I feel like an outlier, I don't know how to fit in. This is all coming from the same place, this conditioning.
I think it's also an attack on the sacred masculine because
Mhm.
it's an attack on critical thinking.
Mhm.
And, if we are indoctrinated to do business as usual and don't question and don't challenge the status quo, then we are being discouraged from critical thinking and charting a different course. Right. So it again is a assault on the sacred principles of both masculine and feminine.
Right. That's
One way or
why,
another.
like healthcare, we often say it's 10 years behind of where we actually are because we actually don't have the higher intelligence running the show here on Earth. You're right. We're leading with actually the wounded aspects of the masculine and the feminine.
Mhm. It's kind of interesting you say we're leading with that because if you ask yourself who really is in power, it's the order followers. They're the ones who create those few people or allow a lot of these other things to go on. So interesting, right? A collective unconscious, a collective of people who are in that certain mindset, perhaps.
And the confusing part is that these leaders are the ones that are getting the accolades and getting pedestaled and getting the awards. It's the reward
Yes.
system, which I think we talk about later. So, again, that confuses society even more because we assume that they're the ones who know what they're doing. So, this is such an incredible psychological mental game. And I'm really excited as we continue
Yeah.
into this presentation because I think we delayer it pretty well.
Yeah, all the blame, all the praise on that one person. It's crazy. When you consider the fact it's like one person isn't in charge of this whole reality. We all share this with each other, so we all have quite a bit of responsibility on part of our actions. And that again empowers the individual, which, is that something that, schools should do? Well, David says that good schools are based on voluntary learning, not coercion. The rapid increase of homeschooling, unschooling, and voluntary schools can be attributed to the desire for self-directed learning, which empowers every student. And you mentioned Waldorf schools, there's many other formats as well, all based on those fundamental principles of like voluntary, like let the student learn what they want to learn, right? Like self-directed learning, he says, is the height of education wherein the learner directs himself and pursues knowledge and skills for his own personal self-interest. I know many folks who say, I go to school, I learn this, I forget it the next year, or I learned this and I don't really need to use it. It's like, then why are we learning it? It's like, we have to ask those questions, if whether you're a student out there or a professor or whatever, what have you. This is built into the fabric of our reality. Like the minute you're born, what school are you going to go to? Oh, you're going to this school. What's your next school? You're going to college? Oh, what's your job? It's like it's put out in like a bit of an assembly line, right? But where is it? Where do you ever ask the question, like, what am I going to do? Like, what is the best path for myself, despite that assembly line? And so he says you learn to walk and talk without coercive curriculum because you naturally desire to learn these skills. This natural tendency to pursue self-growth is innate and will be continually encouraged in all relevant learning organizations. We mentioned the term spontaneity before. It plays a key role here. I talk about the philosophy from ancient China, Taoism, also emphasizes this. And it's a very different way of looking at the world, but seeing how things naturally happen. Like our heart beats by itself, our lungs breathe by itself, and it's like we don't really need to force these to happen. And John Taylor Gatto, here's a quote from him. He says, "You either write your script in life or you become an unwitting actor in the script of someone else's." So take charge of your life, or someone else will take charge of your life, right? Instead of you. And maybe, there can be someone who guides you, not rules over you, not dictates what to do to you, but maybe helps you see your own script as you get older and develop your own mind. Think about
Many
that.
of, many of the true geniuses were self-directed, autodidactic. They've learned on their own. They didn't have the traditional form of education. Not saying that you can't create geniuses that way, but again, we aren't really honoring those true change makers who can recognize the patterns, who have been led by their own consciousness, their own self-directed guidance, and the genius and the change that comes from people with that kind of a mind.
I must say, for myself, my own experience, I didn't expect to be writing books or doing presentations like this. It certainly wasn't school that got me to do this, actually. It was my own passions, my own interests in journaling that eventually led me to this path that I now share with you. And so, what about medical schools, right? I mean, you know, Stephanie, you mentioned this several times, but here's a study that also talks about it. The first year, students may be open-minded. By the end of their studies, they may start to develop a maladaptive ego around their practice. They may also face many problems of their own that need healing. So, practitioners who are in medicine who also need medicine. Interesting. There's a conclusion from the picture here. It says medical student mistreatment remains prevalent. Recurrent mistreatment by faculty and residents is associated with medical student burnout. I mentioned burnout before as well as being quite prevalent. So we could see here a correlation perhaps. Now, let's talk about what we use, right? I mean, perhaps in medical school, we're taught to use certain instructors or instructions to work with our practice. And one that may come to mind is the DSM. And so, Leslie Powers, I want you to expand on this for us. DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders.
Yes, the DSM provides descriptions and names for clusters of symptoms, but rarely addresses the root causes of the disorders listed within. Disorders here in quote, because one of the criticisms is that there is a tendency in the DSM to pathologize normal responses to abnormal treatment, right? That is it really a disorder if a human is responding through their own biopsychosocial system in a certain way that would be considered natural under the circumstances, right? So the diagnoses are global, and they do not adequately express the individuality of the people experiencing the symptoms. Cookie-cutter methods for matching treatments to diagnoses potentially depersonalize those who are labeled. And with this, I'll just add, as a psychotherapist and social worker, I've been working in the field in a variety of settings for over 30 years, that there is a requirement when you see a patient or a client to give them a diagnosis, and generally on the very first visit. So even before a full assessment is complete or all factors of a person's situation is considered, it is required to put a diagnosis, because a diagnosis is very linked to the payment that a provider receives, especially if you're working with any type of insurance or government insurance. So what are labeled or diagnosed as mental health conditions may more truthfully be described as normal biopsychosocial responses to chronic stress and developmental or complex trauma. A few years ago, I took a training with Bessel van der Kolk, who's a leading expert on trauma and a renowned therapist as well. He's a psychiatrist who we'll be quoting a lot later, but he mentioned that he's been lobbying or advocating for the diagnosis of developmental trauma being put in to the DSM as a diagnosis, and he's done this for multiple years and being completely denied and disregarded. And as a therapist, I've reflected on that, because I think that would be a really important thing to add when we're going to actually more accurately diagnose someone. And I think, why wouldn't they want that in there? And I think that the problem could be that if we add developmental trauma into the DSM, that will basically make it unnecessary to use so many of the other diagnoses. You know, why do we need to say, someone has PTSD or depression, or with that, when it's really more specifically accurate to say there's a developmental trauma, right? Or a complex trauma. So medical disorders often go hand in hand with the mental health conditions. And in fact, in my DSM, I was looking earlier today, and there's a real blur between what is physiological and mental health. There are neurodevelopmental disorders in this. There are learning disorders in this. So it's a blur as to what is creating these conditions and their interrelationship. Chronic and unrelenting stress is a factor in creating a mental health disorder. Okay. Stress is caused by living on Earth. However, our cultural system, particularly statism, creates unnecessary levels of chronic stress as a result of adapting to the expectations of survival. It is part of normal life. Statism creates expectations that tax and excessively stress average people, and therefore statism is a big factor in our state of health or disease. Statism, which we could correlate to religion, can contribute to the wear down of our bodies. It is a source of mental and emotional trauma that impedes our functioning. It's a very blurred line. And I'll add, in terms of the DSM, that it's not the end all be all, right? There's a pretty glaring lack of validity and reliability. There's a very subjective element here to these diagnoses. And the pharmaceutical industry has a very powerful impact on the diagnoses themselves, and there are concerns about potential conflicts of interest and influence. There's a glaring lack of consideration for context and culture. And if we think about culture, the symptoms that are being called any particular mental health disorder may be explained very differently in another culture and not seen as pathological at all. So there is an oversimplification here and a potential for stigmatization.
Yes.
So,
I just want to add something really quick from a spiritual point of view, so to speak. And again, there's a lot of tertiary terms around spiritual. So if you're not used to hearing those terms, you may think, well, is this new age? Is this or that? What I will say is that there is a formidable community of people that are quote unquote having what we're calling spiritual awakenings. And these are subsects, cells, groups of people, lots of people. And what they mainly discuss, I'd say the four most prevalent topics in these groups are toxic family systems, healing from childhood, inner child healing. There's the balancing of the masculine and feminine energy. And really what that is a deep healing of our inner anima and animus, or our early childhood caretakers and providers. And there's a lot of discussion around emotional processing and balancing. If you were to take these theories that is being proselytized all over in spiritual communities, and again, some of them are corrupt, some of them are charlatans, but there are a lot of people doing incredible healing work, working together as peers in these areas of healing trauma. If that were to take over, like Leslie said, and we were start to have a different narrative or paradigm where we said, before we diagnose anyone, let's take them through a series of protocols to help them heal their inner child, their childhood situations. Let's really get into the mind of them and see what we can do before there's a diagnosis. The entire game and the entire system, including Big Pharma, would be under risk of incredible loss of profit.
Yeah,
so it's coming. It's
Yeah.
coming, whether they want it or not, and whether it stays separate or not. And I've had a couple of conversations with doctors, and one comes to mind really specifically that was a little bit alarming for me, is we went in deep together on these sorts of issues, and in particular to a group of chronic illness patients. And I said, I don't understand how nobody is talking about trauma. Like, I see it all over the place. They're talking about their family, their childhood. I said, how could we not be talking about this? And I had one of those situations where the doctor became very agitated, became very aggressive. They became like very confused and just trying to use the ego to not receive what I was saying. And it was almost like their eyes just turned dark, turned like black. And I was like, oh man, I could tell right there in that moment that something deeply, innately within them knew that this was a tremendous threat to their existence as an identity within the medical culture.
I'll add that the biopsychosocial aspects of measurement in the DSM has been generally de-emphasized in the newer iterations of the DSM. You can see that picture, it's the 5th edition. So there's updates that happen, and some of the more recent updates have really taken out the previous way of diagnosing, where you would be required to really look at the biopsychosocial aspects and include that in the documentation. Now that isn't even required, it's de-emphasized, and it's strictly the medical coding number that's really being used.
Mm-hmm. As a final note, I would say that, when you mention statism and or religion, we will expand on what we mean by that. Of course, we're not equating statism to religion exactly, but we can see some parallels in the use of organized religion and the use of authority figures. But there are differentiations between a human authority figure, a authority figure that's not human, etc. So we'll discern that as time moves on.
And I think where I put that in there was this
Sure.
idea of dogma, these dogmatic beliefs that are guiding behavior, that there's some similarities that can be with religious fervor.
Right. Yeah. And so DSM-5 Basics and Critics, you can see here a quote. We have the link on the screen as well. The critique of the DSM-5 has focused on deficits in its utility, reliability, and validity. In addition, often it sets a bar too low and exposes both vulnerable people and normal ones to the risks of overdiagnosis and of pathologizing normal conditions. I can never say that word. Further, apparently, the DSM-5 work groups were compromised ethically. Also, the field trials for the DSM-5 used a draft version that was changed for the final version. Finally, I compared the draft and final version and found that any mention of the term biopsychosocial was removed. So this is kind of just confirming some of the things that Leslie has noticed within her practice. And it's amazing to see that there's people out there who are recognizing, wait, this book that we look up to as this authority in medicine is maybe not all that trustworthy as we may think, right? And to even question that, are we able to? But then to go further, how are we willing to then make changes or apply within our own practice some level of variance, some level of discernment?
I was just going to say to any healthcare provider watching this, as a 20-year veteran patient myself, and I've been amongst some of the top institutions and challenged some of the top doctors in particular fields, is I've often said as a patient who's a peer mentor for other patients, just what this quote says here. I say to them straight out, you think too low of your patients. You think too low of your patients, and you're keeping them trapped, and you think that it's they aren't capable. I said, it's actually you're participating in that disempowerment. And this has been asked of me many times as a patient from other providers. How do I get my patients to be like you? How do I get this? And I said, well, I don't listen to you. That's how I mean, I'm not saying I disobey and I'm a rebel and I don't take a medication if I need it, but literally I call them out and I say, I don't listen to the majority of the stuff you say to me. I don't buy your fear. I've overcome that. And I said, if you're asking me how to empower your patients without seeing your own place within that equation, you have more learning to do. And I have no problem saying that to them.
Yeah. And I see the catch-22 that the providers are in, because even if they honor you as an equal and an individual in the medical room, right? They still have a pressure upon them to give you a certain diagnosis,
Sure.
right? That is required for you to get the treatment. Right. So that is how that third party, that system effect is requiring a label in order to authorize the medicine or the treatment, and then, or for a person to qualify for aid or financial assistance or other things that would help, to get the psychosocial supports that they need. They may need to give in to the stigma of a particular label.
You know what, Leslie, you reminded me of something that it really brings it full circle. In last episode, we talked about the possible negative connotations to labeling theory from a patient perspective and how they can adopt this self-sabotaging role. What you just said, and saying that even if there is quote unquote participatory care in the actual clinic and a doctor is trying to see you as an equal, at the end of the day, there is a hierarchy that's obligated. There's an obligation for the hierarchical atmosphere because of the diagnosis and what they have to do in the insurance model. Could the doctor also just subliminally be adopting that labeling theory from their end as well and keeping the hierarchy skewed? Because at the end of the day, that's how they have to be. So the labeling theory concept is actually for the patient and the provider to keep them separate.
Right. Otherwise, there's the dissonance within the provider, about their own job as well.
Right.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
as a counselor myself, I just like to point out how little value the label serves in the actual process of helping a person. Almost to a person, people need to be able to speak freely and with confidence and trust about their difficulties and traumas, and the manifestations or symptoms from individual to individual can vary. And of course, it's human nature to want to classify and say these kind of people, the narcissists, the other, kinds of people with various disorders that have very little, other than organizing in general, have very little value in themselves as a label. And people don't like to be labeled either. So I just wanted to remind people that, when there's some reason for labels that you could, endorse. However, the actual process of helping someone, the talk therapy is very much, the same across the boards, and it helps people get out of whatever disorder they are, to be able to speak freely about their traumas, to release their traumas so that they're no longer as burdening on the individual. That's all.
I'll second that the diagnoses themselves have very little bearing on the therapy. And that the therapy is not really that different from person to person based on whether they have a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, or even a PTSD. There may be more specialized treatments for a severe trauma effect, but the human mind works the same for everyone. And like you said, Scott, the symptoms may be different, but the root methods of healing and integration are not really that different. I don't need to give people a diagnosis. I do that because it's required, by an insurance company. I have a framework in my mind that's much more based holistically on what's going on with that person.
Just to reiterate from a patient perspective is I've been asked, and I think we discussed this last time, to sit in with doctors as a life coach / peer mentor, somebody who has the lived experience to help a patient who's in crisis or in need. So I've literally sat in appointments with doctors at the patient's permission to be there as a source of emotional support from a peer point of view. And I've had multiple high-level providers say to me the same thing. After an initial visit, they'll say to me, wow, I am shocked. They told you more about the reality of their situation in 15 minutes than I've gotten out of them all year. And I've said, because I'm not diagnosing them, I'm not wearing a white coat. I'm just coming in as somebody, as an equal, on an equal playing field who has a similar experience, and there's a comfort level. And very often I want to mention, in those times that I had sat in on those appointments, typically when I was allowed to speak, the patient would immediately cry first. They would cry. The doctor would be there. They would go through their thing with their doctor. And then what I would say, hey, I've also had this experience. I've lived there. And the doctor would be witnessing it. It was like the patient immediately could feel that shift of holding space for their authenticity and vulnerability. The first thing the patient do would cry, and then the information would flow.
Wow. I must say, when I started health coaching, like literally it didn't take me long. It was like my second client, and she was crying. Like she was just like bawling in tears, like opening up, so expressive. I'm like, wow. It's like, where did this come from? And it's like, this is me starting out as a health coach, just approaching with a little bit of sympathy. It's like, wow. Just opening up the space, right? Allowing listening. So
Allowing
incredible.
time, right?
Yes.
Giving time and space.
Yeah.
Putting your energy towards, being receptive to hearing another person's experience and really caring about it is very magical and powerful. And if we look at the amount of time that providers are given with their patients, it's sadly very short. And
Yeah.
what's the impact of that?
I
Right.
just want to quickly add the concept of care that we're talking about and the power of transformation and honesty and health and potential healing that can occur when somebody truly holds the space of care and it is able to integrate that right hemisphere with the left and not be just strictly logical. The power of that is unique in that it can't be faked. There's no sort of empathy training you can take. There's no sort of class that you can take in med school to try to let me see how I can enhance my care so my patient trusts me. It has to be something that's birthed within your own development of your own consciousness. A patient will not truly open up to you unless there's a resonance in the biofield that this person, this provider, I can sense that they actually care about me. And for anybody who's watching this, is senses are very powerful. And as a patient who's seen many doctors across the country at prestigious institutions, I can tell when somebody's trained in care and trying to get me to open up to trust them, and when somebody's actually self-aware and I actually trust that they care about me. There is a stark difference between those two. This is why every provider needs to do their own work as well, especially if you're an authority in health and care.
Yeah. Incredible.
The conditions of the workplace can result in diminished care because it puts providers in a state of stress themselves. And then all of these catch-22s that then naturally parts of themselves will shut down, caring parts, the parts that are frustrated at the decisions that they have to make, the triaging that maybe they have to make with their time. And so the conditions themselves can lead to these experiences you're describing, Stephanie, where a provider isn't able to access their full heart and care.
Right. And the critical part of this, as you, a provider, and me acting as a patient in this situation, is that don't think for a second that that does not cascade down onto your patient. Your same stressors, your same time limitations, your same stuckness in logic happens to me as a patient in that room. So many times I would go, I would have, I was an organ failure, right? I had a lot going on. And I would, they would say, well, remember, write all your questions down because we only have so much time. And so I couldn't go in with any heart, any feelings, any consciousness. I was like, okay, my first question is this. My second question is this. There was no way that I could truly connect. And I think this is what's really important, is that everything that's going on with the doctor and the provider, don't you think for a second that you're pulling any wool over anyone's eyes, that you're not affecting your patients with that. The conversely is, you may have the good patient who takes all their notes and they go in very logical, just like you need them to be. And I've been that patient, and I've had doctors say, oh, I love you. I'm like, yeah, because I've had to turn into you to get care. Bottom line. Right. The other facet that can happen in the imbalance is that because the patient is in that wound of not being heard, validated, seen appropriately for their illness by the authority, is they can become hyper emotional. And then you throw that in front of a doctor and it gets very confusing. Then all of a sudden, well, let's get a psychologist. I don't know how to deal with it. Oh, my patient's a little crazy. Either way, it's not right.
This brings us back to the slide on what impacts trust in the patient-provider relationship in our first part of our presentation.
Yeah,
it's very relevant.
Wow, very, very good, guys. Very good discussion. And here, we have a slide talk about unifying causality in psychology, being, brain, and behavior, a book by Gerald Young. This magistral treatise approaches the integration of psychology through the study of the multiple causes of normal and dysfunctional behavior. Causality is the focal point reviewed across disciplines. Using diverse models, the book approaches unifying psychology as an ongoing project that integrates genetics, experience, evolution, brain development, change mechanisms, and so on. The book includes in its integration free will, epitomized as freedom in being. It pinpoints the role of our self, the self, in causality and the freedom we have in determining our own behavior. Isn't that interesting? Psychology and then talking about freedom, right? It's like interesting because we're making a lot of these connections here as well while we're presenting. So this book deals with disturbed behavior as well and tackles the DSM-5 approach to mental health and mental disorders and the etiology of psychopathology. Young examines all these topics with a critical eye and gives many innovative ideas and models that will stimulate thinking on the topic of psychology and causality for decades to come. It is truly integrative and original. And I'm pretty sure this is a very big book, right, Leslie? You shared this with me. I was like amazed seeing this. And is this like a alternative to the DSM-5 or a critique? It seems like it has a lot of aspects in it.
It's a critical analysis, I would say, more than likely. And I wanted just to highlight this idea of freedom of being. What does that mean? What would it feel like to be free to be yourself? And how does that impact our freedom to act? And if we're not, and vice versa, if we're not free to act naturally, then how will that create our sense of being, right? So freedom is an important concept when it comes to healthcare and looking at psychology and this whole concept of authority.
Yeah, and even the history and all the statistics we shared. I mean, I would argue it has to. Again, top cause of death. I mean, that should be right away. At least it concerns me. Like what's going on?
Free expression.
Yeah.
How safe are you in the room with your provider to express yourself freely? Are you relaxed enough to think straight? And, there's lots of implications.
Yeah, and here's another, article study talking about the DSM-5, the facts, myths, and open issues. It says here, quote, in fact, to date, there is no knowledge on whether most conditions listed in the manual are true diseases. Does sum up a lot of the things you guys have been saying. So if you want, pause, you can read over this quote and, reflect on it. But I think you guys kind of expanded on a lot of this quite well. Leslie, you contributed to these slides quite a bit with your experience.
Yeah, and think of, for example, a youth who is not following the rules in school and who are defiant towards a teacher. They can very quickly get a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder. Once a child is labeled, for example, with a diagnosis like that, that can really impact how that child is viewed and treated throughout their entire school experience into adulthood, can easily lead to a slippery slope of interventions that then perpetuate the diagnosis and could lead to, another diagnosis of conduct disorder and so forth and so on. So we need to be very sensitive about this, especially I would say with boys and that particular diagnosis.
Yes. And so, are we living in a sick society? I mean, we went over all the statistics before about how there's all these different problems going on. Well, many mental health diagnoses, including the standard personality disorders, have clear causal roots in the sickness of society, modern culture itself, and the traumas and chronic stress that perpetrate within, such as major depressive disorders, general anxiety disorder, PTSD, substance use disorders, borderline personality traits, histrionic traits, narcissistic personality disorder, or autism. More people being treated and diagnosed means that more people are sick. And you may even see signs in commercials like we're treating all these people. It's like that's not necessarily a good thing because over time this seems to be seen as normal. It's like we're treating all these people and we have all these different drugs and we have all these different classifications. It's helping us. But is it really? Is this really normal? Is this something that we want to normalize? And is it really actually getting down to the root cause? Cultures can be limiting and pressuring, even oppressive. I mean, you have societal expectations, 40 plus hour work weeks, consumerism, fast food, technological use, schooling, and then you have two working parents. So like on a family level and a society level and an individual level and a system level, you were dealing with a lot of different pressures and limitations and oppressions. But perhaps we can approach this. If we're really looking at all this from a medical point of view, maybe we can approach this intelligently and we can get to some of the root causes here. And that's what we're talking about here with statism, right? Introducing a concept that hasn't been talked about. So can our current mental health crisis in the world be connected to the states of freedom versus dependence? How do we treat it? Can our individual health be affected by the power systems, by the media, by literally what's out there that we don't see necessarily as impacting our health, but how many people are in fear from the media when they say something's about to happen or something is happening? And how does that play a role on somebody's health when everybody around them is talking about it and there's so much hysteria? This idea of hysteria is something as well that we can talk about. So the effects of culture. The diagnostic manual defines a personality disorder as having an enduring pattern of inner or outer experience that deviates markedly from expectations of the individual's culture. Leslie mentioned that some individuals may be diagnosed as like crazy, going mad. And throughout history, people have had all sorts of ways of displaying this. For instance, witch trials, right? Oh, you have these certain traits. You're a witch. You need to be burned. You need to be hung. I mean, people were very emotionally invested into that belief system. And so it became the truth. And they started passing it through law. And then anybody who exhibited certain traits had to be facing that fate. I mean, maybe there were witches, but it's like to have that categorization, it's now putting everybody under this one broad stroke. And so it's something to be careful of. If the culture is unhealthy, then people who follow it will also be unhealthy. Yet they may be perceived as healthy. So it can work the other way around, right? Like some people may not be getting treatment, and then some people may be getting too much treatment.
Well, and if you're persecuting the witch, does that make you healthy because you're in the majority of people scared of witches? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of ancient cultures with a lot of belief systems that we may look back on now and say, that was kind of barbaric. And why did we do that? It's like to us, it seems like common sense as to, yeah, we shouldn't do that. So people who see the sickness of culture and live contrary to it may be labeled as mentally ill when they may be more healthy than the well adapted. Isn't that crazy as a dynamic? Is that somebody who is diseased maybe isn't diseased at all?
I wanted to just mention in many ancient cultures, somebody who actually was initiated into their nature as a shaman once started out by somebody who appeared to be losing their mind, but the culture understood the nature of the initiation process. And they knew that that was going to be the future leader of the culture. And they came together and stewarded and gave the right attention or connection to that individual to help them come into the gifts or the initiatory processes that was coming into them to help them guide from a more prophetic point of view. But here in America, that could get somebody a serious diagnosis and lifelong medications. So are we actually numbing certain people who are the prophets of our society or helping to guide us with new ideas?
And put in jail as well if you deviate from the standard protocol. There's a risk of being seen as a criminal and being put in jail for going outside your scope of practice or not following the rules of your license.
And wouldn't that be convenient for the people who have a particular agenda to be jailing and diagnosing and numbing the people who were sent to help evolve the culture?
Yeah. Is our culture limiting? Is it really, pressuring us, or is it a culture that is kind of accepting of a lot of people, but at the same time not victimizing or putting certain people on a pedestal because of that? So it's like, what is our culture nowadays, and how does it affect our minds? I mean, we could say that the art and the music and all of these expressions are part of the culture. And so how they're affected, may affect our mind and it may affect our actions. And do we have a culture that is still based on the past, or is it really moving forward to a better future? I would say that, a lot of trauma could still be existing, and we'll talk about that. We talked about trauma a little bit, but we're going to be diving deeper into that. And so we mentioned collectivism briefly. Well, here's a summary by G. Edward Griffin, who's an author who writes pretty deeply about this subject. He says basically collectivism is an ideology that prioritizes the group over the individual, often leading to totalitarian systems like communism, fascism, and Nazism. Basically, any ism orology imposed upon everybody, right? It's like this is what everybody must follow. And that's, means that you have to sacrifice yourself for the group versus the individual. And the belief that the individual should be sacrificed for that greater good, and that government is perceived as the solution, or that the institutions or the experts, the authority, it's a mentality that views it's the primary solution to all, different societal problems, right? We all may point to that one thing, say this will help us. And educational influence, many individuals are taught to admire collectivism through government-controlled education, as we mentioned, leading to a cycle of increased governmental power. So it's sort of like a feedback loop, right? The culture is ingraining this belief system, that belief system ingrains that government, and the government supports that culture. And it's just like a feeding back loop. And then the parents teach that same mentality to their children. And then the medical system may teach that. So we have to be careful. Is there some sort of transference happening there? Is there some sort of projecting? There's implications because collectivism fosters a mindset where government intervention is seen as necessary for societal improvement, often at the expense of personal freedoms. And we gave many examples in history. So understanding collectivism is crucial for recognizing its impact on modern governance and individual rights. You may even see throughout history how things have moved more in that direction of recognizing individuals, at least somewhat, right? Because of course, World War II was not long ago. But you can see, for instance, with the foundation of America, that this rejection of the monarchy, this rejection of this person has this divine right to rule because he's a king or queen, was perhaps a direction more toward individual rights. And then the abolitionists saying, hey, slavery is wrong. This person has rights. They have freedom. These might be seen as examples of us moving in the better direction. And now with technology and having mass information, I believe that we can truly fulfill our understanding of ourselves and perhaps the ownership of ourselves and the authority of ourselves. At least that's from my point of view, studying collectivism.
I think we need to watch out for any trends that are turning us back in the other direction, where the individual is being disregarded and seen as not having rights.
Yes.
Yeah.
And similar to practice, right? With the DSM, it's like you're following this one manual that everyone else is following. You're doing it because you maybe think, well, that's the best way to do it because I was taught to do it. I mean, if I don't do it, what will happen to me? So it's collectivism and also connected to this concept, tribalism, right? And Mike Adams, he's a scientist prominent in Texas. He talks about this idea as it's a key mechanism, tribalism, for social control, categorizing individuals into rigid groups that limit personal identity and expression. So this you can see is relatively connected to collectivism and culture that is limiting. And so conformity pressure, individuals face immense social pressure to conform to the norms and beliefs of their tribe, leading to a loss of diversity and creativity. There's psychological boundaries where society imposes artificial boundaries that restrict exploration of ideas and consciousness, hindering personal growth and innovation. There's the courage to explore. Challenging these constraints requires courage and is essential for unlocking human potential and achieving higher consciousness. Okay, so recognizing tribalism, recognizing collectivism. So you can recognize who you are amongst the crowd. Like you may have a bunch of robots in line. You may be that one order follower in that whole lineup, but you recognize, wait, I don't have to be this. I can say no while everyone else is saying yes. And so it's a visionary perspective. It's embracing the off-limits areas of thought and creativity, and that can lead to significant personal and societal transformation, positioning individuals as pioneers for future generations. So isn't that interesting? They become the leaders of other people. But are they seeking authority just because they're becoming a leader? Perhaps they're inspiring others. Perhaps others want to voluntarily follow them. But they're not claiming to have more rights than them or claiming to do wrong, that they can do wrong and that it's right for them to do so, that they, should not be responsible with their own life. I think, a leader should show by example. Personally, what do you think, right? What is a natural leader? What's somebody who exhibits traits of leadership?
A natural leader should always be one that's working on the empowerment of those that they claim to serve.
And underneath this is a value for self, and the recognition that every individual has intrinsic value and that your voice does matter. And so any environment you're in where there is a challenge to that is devaluing you and your voice is toxic. It is based in coercion or an unhealthy dynamic.
Yeah.
Or a half-truth, which can be very dangerous.
Yeah.
We might differentiate what we're talking about here is healthcare versus healing, right? You have a system where people are actually looking at the individual and caring for them versus healthcare, where is there really care in that system? If it's all systematic, if it's all mechanical, it's all done by the books and by the experts and the authorities. We have to think, is the word heals and health, are we really healing?
This could be described very reductionistically as, again, the proclivity for an action-oriented solution in healthcare to fix a problem as the masculine energy. That's the expression. He wants to fix, but then the process of healing would be the element of the feminine, and which is directly related to care, which we don't have time for anymore, apparently.
Yes.
And an observation I'd like to make from our last set of slides about the collectivism and tribalism is that when you do get into the inner work, the counseling, and begin to alleviate some trauma. These negatives of groups begin to fade away. You're empowering the individual. And another thing that's leading into our next section is when you empower people, you're enhancing their health or their ability to recover, heal, and exhibit good health.
Mm-hmm. Healing is a process that takes time. When we accept that, we recognize it, we apply it in our practice, then yes, we are willing to accept that fact that in order for somebody to truly heal, it's going to take time. We have to work with, where the body is currently at, perhaps.
And I think a quick clarion call to everybody watching is, are we ready to cultivate and take this broken system that we all agree that we have and try to find something where these two forces, the powerful force of fixing and healing and tech and solution, can be married to the aspects of true sustainable transformation and healing?
Yes.
Unfortunately, sadly, at this point in history, I think that we can safely say that it really is predominantly a sick care model, which is sad because it limits our potential for healing and transformation. Once we get that label and that diagnosis, which we've already touched on briefly, it's very difficult to have room for a transformation to occur when that label is pinned on you for the duration of your life. So for me personally, healthcare was there to help provide a solution, a fix it to a specific problem. And indeed, I had some wonderful technicians and even surgeons in dire situations where I needed a fix it type solution. But in terms of life and the evolution of our process of living here on Earth, transformation and evolution and healing needs to be coupled, I believe, back in with healthcare. And right now, sadly, I believe these two are actually decoupled, and we may not even truly understand the role of healing within healthcare.
Yeah, and I will add that I see healing as a whole person process, an experience of all aspects of a person in what helps them to be thriving and happy and productive. And that healthcare often is occurring in silos where there's separation of parts of our whole being. And so one of our, I think, messages throughout this is about this integration of all the parts of ourselves and in how do we achieve healing in mind, body, spirit.
Yeah, what do you think, Scott?
For me, healing is a natural thing and a natural process in the body or in nature. And it's a result of good healthcare. It's what should be the result of good healthcare, good, authentic healthcare. So although it's not always a result of healthcare, it can happen by itself. We certainly expect healthcare to provide healing.
People perhaps healing people, average everyday people, perhaps knowing about nutrition, knowing about the modalities they can take, where they may not even need a doctor or a healthcare system, we would call it, but there's healing taking place.
Great. Wonderfully said, Corey. We have to reconnect the parts. We may have wonderful specialists, expert specialists in a particular part, but if nobody's connecting the parts together, there's no holism that's even possible.
Yeah. And healing can occur outside of the healthcare system. You don't really need the healthcare system always to heal.
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about these systems because it seems like a lot of people look up to these different systems for perhaps their source of healing, right? And we even know that, relating this to the government systems and the politics of our world, which has a great influence on medicine, that more than 2/3 of Congress cashed a pharma campaign check in 2020, a new stat analysis shows. Right? And there's a lot of money going to these different candidates on both sides, on every aisle, anyone in politics. So the question is, are people, really in it for health, or are they really actually just following the money? Many cases, right? And many people know this, right? It's like the money might be in control of things here. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we shift away from that model? Well, we have to make one that is not just more effective, but one that is perhaps more profitable. What do you guys think?
I would like to specifically say, which is a bit controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that we're upon an election in several days, and not one candidate took a specific view or vantage on what had happened over the period of COVID and the subsequent issues that have arisen with the vaccine. That issue has been almost completely avoided. I think that maybe Trump might be trying to indicate something around that with potentially bringing on RFK. There's been word of him, Trump giving him the role of taking over some of the federal health agencies. But I find it so fascinating that neither one of them had a strict opinion or belief as to what happened at all. And I think it's what we're looking at. That's the reason why right there.
Yeah, furthermore, statism and some of the concepts and ideas we're talking about are not really ever mentioned, in political talk or among the medical community either. So, unfortunately, these types of systems, as they are going to be problematic, even taking money perhaps out of the scenario, right? Looking at just how people believe, and they say, oh, well, these people are my source of health, but I can't take charge personally. So, and if you can tell here, just by us presenting, we're emphasizing a lot of personal responsibility, personal sovereignty on part of the individual to heal themselves in many ways. Because, I mean, look at all this money. Why? Why are we spending so much money on these different things? I mean, it's getting very expensive for a lot of people, right? People can't afford it. But yet, we can grow certain things, perhaps in our local vicinity, that doesn't cost much money at all. So there's questions. It's like, well, are we doing that? Right? And where do our medicines come from? Like what? There's a lot of questions to ask. But here you can see top pharmaceutical industry contributors, Pfizer and Merck and different companies here. A lot of different money going to different candidates. So it's hard to keep track of it all. There's a lot of money going in all sorts of different directions. And so again, why?
It's very profitable when you outsource your own healing and your own potential. And that's how systems often thrive, is by having people outsource their energy, their sovereignty, and their choices at every possible turn that they can. And sadly, there are certain pharmaceuticals that can be needed and required, but the wielding of power in lieu of money and domination is just completely, we've just missed the mark on such an epic level that this is something that needs to be addressed. And honestly, I would love to see a candidate address this, because this, I believe, is one of our main issues that is up against humanity at this point in time.
Having worked in a medical setting, I witnessed firsthand the representatives of different drugs coming in and giving us lunch and different types of perks, and then providing education to the medical providers based on their own research and their own biases that clearly build up to a case to use their drug. So there is a bias that is definitely in place. And a lot of these providers are so busy that they're not getting education outside of that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of trust. And typically what I saw is after a new pharmaceutical visit, then the providers would be starting to prescribe that particular medicine more often.
Mhm.
Leslie, you brought up such a key point here in terms of academia and research papers and medicine and the medical field, is that there's been such a deep, profound conditioning of trusting like minds or people like them, or trusting people amongst their own field, that you're right, they can just very easily buy in. I think there's something called ostrich syndrome. I'm not quite sure if that's it specifically, where again, it's just you become a little bit willfully ignorant and blindly start trusting because that's your whole identity revolves around the research that's coming out within your field. If you can't trust the research behind your own field, then your whole field starts to detangle in a way. So this blindful, willful trusting needs to stop. I believe we need to start to
Yes.
second guess and hold people responsible.
Yeah,
And,
well,
and yeah, this is where those two aspects of statism comes in, right? Not just to the authority figure in politics, but the authority figure who's the expert, who claims to have all the statistics on their side, right? Those two types of authority figures that we identified earlier. I mean, that's at play here, right? There's the medical authority figure, and then there's the politician, and one can sometimes contribute to the other. And you have to ask yourself, well, why are all these companies and businesses using law to protect themselves, to make their product more accessible against competition? What's going on here, right? What do they need the lawmakers for when they're donating money to candidates?
Mhm, mhm.
I
Corey, can I
think
just
we've
add?
reached an alarming point where the collusion between the pharmaceutical industry and government has reached such dominance and has come to control a lot of the medical education, a lot of the medical information, and a lot of the medical practices that we have.
There's a gentleman that I listen to right now who was exiled from his own field as an academic for speaking truth. He was very recently discussing what he calls the Cartesian crisis, which is now people in academia who did hold a lot of this blind trust. Now there's so much chaos and confusion that a lot of them don't know what is true. So when they don't know what is true, they tend to resort to that which still they were doing in the past, because if they don't, everything as they knew it changes. So this Cartesian crisis of just so much chaos that now they don't know what to believe, so they tend to still continuously default into what they've been doing in this circle of people who they do have trust with, unless they extradite themselves from the community, which is
Yes.
rarer because people are still reliant on the money and the
Mhm.
insurance and everything that's coming from them from their position as a medical doctor or academic.
yeah, Steph. And then this confusion is trickling down to the patients as well. And they are in a parallel type of crisis about they not knowing what to believe
Mhm.
and what is accurate. And they then often fall back on trusting their provider, especially if it's one that they have trusted in the past, who they feel like is looking out for them, and they turn to the person.
Right.
Yeah.
And Leslie, just to add the other side of this so people know that we're not one-sided here, we're very multidimensional in the aspects of what we're seeing, is that you're right, a patient will tend to default to what their provider says, but what if a patient wants to challenge what their provider says? This has cost patients their doctor by challenging what their doctor have said. And ironically, this is the same thing that's happening to the actual medical staff. If they question the authority, they then get canceled or pigeonholed as, whatever. So they have us all so spiraling out of control mentally that we really need to start to get the reins back on truth and start to incentivize a proper healthcare system that incorporates healing and truth.
Yeah. Well, part of that perhaps is understanding this concept of statism that we're mentioning here. The belief in authority for professional expertise, the worship of higher education and letters after a name can be used to put fear and doubt in clients, to promote blind trust of the professionals or experts. It becomes all too easy to deflect responsibility from healing oneself to others healing you. Information control within the medical or mental health or psychiatric fields can then be used to manipulate average people to doubt themselves and feel powerless on their own. And again, this goes back to the confusion you guys are talking about. If anybody out there listening right now feels at all confused, I would not blame you, right? Like Stephanie said, this can be like, well, what do I do then? It feels like money and all this influence, all this corruption is just built in and ingrained within the system. How are we supposed to confront it? How are we supposed to change that? It just seems like it's inevitable.
I just want to mention something. Again, the compassion that I hold from a lot of providers who are starting to question, which is the more dangerous thing to do. Being willfully ignorant is the easier thing to do. And at the soul level, at some point, that most people suffer. right? But to question what's going on and to start to question your place within that is the brave thing to do. And kudos to anyone out there doing it. And we absolutely feel you. I think every single one of us on this panel has been through that same experience in our fields and what work we are working with. And we have found ways to face ourselves bravely and boldly and overcome and persevere. But I have a very good friend of mine who's in the psychiatric field. She's a brilliant human being. And she reached out to me the other day and she said, I don't know what to do. I feel like the system is trying to kill me.
Wow.
And I absolutely, you don't know what to say in those positions. So just to everybody listening, we're trying to offer love and healing and a space for you to rest, to know that you're not alone, but we still have to make sure that everybody has the right information.
And so when we're talking about the mind and the psyche in relationship to statism and medicine, let's talk about this medical mental servitude, the very system that claims to promote health through science and medicine is propagating mental servitude in multiple ways here that we're laying out on this slide. Well, disempowering individuals from critical thought and questioning authorities, promoting unhealthy solutions such as the overuse of and dependency on pharmaceuticals, withholding of information about viable alternative healing options or modalities, whether that's intentional or not, ignoring lifestyle options that can help prevent illness, i.e., nutrition, sleep, detoxification, time management, and rest, and hiding or ignoring information about how the government and big corporations may actually be doing environmental and health damage through weather engineering, GMOs, preservatives, dyes, and foods. And I know some of this stuff may be considered controversial, right? But a lot of those doctors that we listed before who escaped the medical field, who were willing to sort of speak out and willing to lose their job, are sharing a lot of these different modalities that we're sharing here. And you have to ask yourself why. And so maybe, they got out of their confusion and now they found a new path, a new direction for themselves. Why did they choose that? And, that courage, I mean, what made them want to be so courageous to prompt upon such an action? Well, we looked at history and also saw a bunch of problems that happened when people were not courageous, when people did not question authority, when people did not see that there were healthier solutions or better ways of doing things. So it makes us really question our own mind. Are we mentally in a servitude, stuck in a system that we feel like we can't escape, but we truly actually can? All right. Well, let's talk about some of those mental manipulations that can go on. For instance, gaslighting in the Hegelian dialectic. You may have not heard of this. This is usually in the realm of philosophy, you might say, or psychology in some cases. We may be creating health problems to promote the created solutions, the drugs and vaccines, etc., without ever really addressing the root causes of illness and mental health problems. There may also be a lack of informed consent, as we talked about before, and practitioners may have further access to knowledge that the public does not have. So the supposed solutions can often perpetrate the problems. New drugs, new laws, there's false flags, and these have been events all throughout history we'll go into. So who is to really blame? Where is the real solution? When you have all these new drugs being introduced, you have these doctors who are compliant or the patients who are compliant. Who do we put the blame on? And where is the real solution? Now, if you don't know what gaslighting is, it's a subtle form of emotional manipulation that often results in the recipient doubting their perception of reality and their sanity.
This first sentence, we may be creating health problems to promote created solutions. And so that is implying an intentionality, and I think that we want to make a comment about intentionality versus sort of accidental. And a lot of people, will question that idea of intentionally creating a problem to promote a solution. However, that is a real a real occurrence.
Yes.
And I also think that I think about the idea of, let's say, medication and psychiatric medications, or even any other type of medication. Often the medication itself will create another problem, at which point then another pharmaceutical is added on top of that cocktail to treat the symptom of the first medication. And I've seen that really like multiply, and people can be on, 6 medications that are all then creating an impact on the liver or the gut that then, leads to a health problem later, where then, they have to revamp everything, in their whole lifestyle and can't eat certain foods, so there's this effects of one problem being treated with a medication or a treatment that then creates another problem, and it keeps rolling and rolling into this big, big, big snowball. Now, if we are seeing this happen, why are we allowing that to continue to happen? I think is one of my questions. And there's a certain, I think, a surrender somehow that that's all we can do. And I think that we need to question that.
Mhm. Yeah, when you mention, when we're talking about one drug to the next, one law to the next, and different measures that are brought upon our society or upon our patients or clients, upon the different medicines that exist, we're talking about thesis, antithesis, synthesis here potentially, not actually getting down to the root cause of the problem. So that's where the Hegelian dialectic comes in, and then the gaslighting may act as this justification or enforcement mechanism, where somebody says, well, I was just doing my job, I was just doing my duty, and oh, you're crazy and you're so dramatic. Why are you being so sensitive? Trying to pass off their own responsibility using different forms of manipulation, and not actually getting down to addressing the problem.
I'd like to mention something really quick about gaslighting and this relationship between the system, the patients, and the providers. And I'd like to take it right back down to med school again. I know I mentioned this in one of our last recordings, is that the majority of med school students that I've met and I've come in contact with working within the field that I have, is that there is a genuine, intentional eagerness to follow their calling of being of service to help people. And again, I just want to recognize that for those of you watching this, this may be hard to swallow, right? And we're not blatantly saying that you are evil if you're not aware of this, because the conditioning and gaslighting that medical students receive within their own educational system normalizes some of these very unhealthy behaviors. So there is this very fine line between nescience, right? Which is like, I literally don't know what I don't know. And this is what I've been conditioned. This is what I believe is right, because this is what my peers believe is right. And this is what the science says is right. And this is what the research says is right. And I want to do the right thing, so I have to listen to that. The bubble becomes insulary, and we are living in a multi-dimensional world at this point, where we are many layers and many parts. And if you are simply conditioned in one system way of being, you're going to be behind no matter what your peers say. So I encourage everybody to always pop your bubble. No matter if you're an expert in your field, push yourself out of your boundaries of your own bubble and lean into that which makes you feel uneasy, that which triggers you about an alternative health therapy. Go and investigate it and try to understand from someone else's point of view. Try not to be triggered by what your patients want or what humanity is saying that you maybe haven't been taught. Open your mind, pop your bubble. Learn outside of your system of knowing.
Right. Because you can get stuck inside this dialectic and not realize it is a dialectic, right? You can be a part of that thesis or antithesis, not realizing it's all being used for a greater agenda at play here.
Yeah.
So let's look at some historic examples of this, just so you can kind of get more of an understanding of what we mean here and connecting a lot of the ideas we're talking about. U.S. Operation Mockingbird was an alleged large-scale program of the CIA in America that began in the early 1950s and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. So there's the agenda, right? It is said to have recruited leading American journalists into a network to help present the CIA's views, funded student and cultural organizations, and influenced foreign media. This is all public. The operation reportedly involved the CIA placing its own agents to work undercover as journalists in major news outlets, as well as cultivating relationships with existing reporters to shape news coverage favorably for the agency's objectives. So by introducing, some people will call this cooperatives or people who are put in place to kind of like stir the pot a little bit, things can get mixed up. Things can get a little confusing on purpose to draw a new agenda. Okay. And so they're introducing, agents into organizations that relatively consist of just people who were trying to share the truth, right? Now there's these people entering with an agenda who aren't necessarily sharing the truth. And what's going to happen now? The truth gets mixed with the lie, and that makes the lie potentially more dangerous, more deceitful, where it's not seen as a lie because people now trusted this news media for everything else they said, but now they introduce something else. So, oh, that must also be trustworthy.
Yeah, I wanted to connect the last slide a bit with this topic of the media and the dilemma that I think both patients and providers have which I'm noticing in a lot of my clients, where they are experiencing more mysterious, unexplained symptoms or syndromes going on in their bodies and that are interacting with their mental health. And some of them are suspecting a potential injury that came as a result of taking some immunizations over the last few years. And those concerns are being met with just almost like shrugging of the shoulders of the medical providers and the medical providers doing the same old types of lab work coming out as good, clear. They can't find anything wrong with that person, and yet that person is experiencing very real and clear pain and health symptoms. And they're both sides, I think, are very frustrated. But there's a kind of a wall that seems to be hit where I think the health providers can't even entertain certain possible explanations because in part because of this media impact and how it is tied into the medical protocols and their licensing and all of that. And people are just frustrated. And this gaslighting effect is occurring where, the providers may be, implying that it's in their head and that there's really nothing wrong with them medically. And so we're at a crossroads that I'm seeing with more and more people where we need to look at this added layer here of what's not being shared and what other influences there are on the creation of these illnesses, things like autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia, long COVID, all these things. What is really underlying, and are the medical providers getting all the information that they deserve?
Yeah. What comes to mind as well is, this scenario would not happen if individuals simply thought for themselves and continued, the path of trying to be honest and truthful to their integrity in journalism. But people start attaching their identity to, hey, I'm part of this network, and I'm expected to outsource a lot of my research material from other people. So, if those materials become corrupted or infiltrated, and you're not discerning for yourself, you're going to become now the dishonest reporter because you're not aware that there might be some sort of manipulation going on within your own network. And so the same thing can happen in a medical field, it can happen in politics, it can happen anywhere where people are shutting off their conscience and not really thinking for themselves over what's coming into them, whether it's a new drug or new law, etc. People usually go along with it because they believe it to be good. They believe it to be necessary and part of, the process.
I was just going to say, you were talking about consciousness and not being aware. Is consciousness is granted, and if you're not willing to lean into that which is uncomfortable and examine your belief system and really stand up for what is right, it's not something that necessarily everybody is willfully going against their consciousness. It's that you lose access to it. You literally fall asleep. You fall asleep when you keep denying that which is asking to be faced within you. You start to fall asleep. And in fact, I've spoken to not one, but two pioneering individuals in the healthcare field. And they've been aware that at times they've been connected to this higher state of awareness and consciousness, and they start to see the problems. And then what happens is they disconnect from those that are encouraging their conscious awareness. They return back to the environment with those around them who are proselytizing that same narrative. And they would actually come back to me and said, I've fallen asleep again. It's because they keep returning to the same environment that's not encouraging them to broaden their awareness and literally wake up. So consciousness is something that can be willfully ignored and suppressed because you're afraid or whatever it may be, or it can be something that you keep putting yourself in an environment that literally puts you to sleep.
Yeah, maybe to ask that as a question too, among a lot of these systems, right? These very institutionalized, you have to stay in your place, wear a certain title, wear a certain, and that what mentality does that create in individuals, right? So, I mean, here's another one, right? An Operation Northwoods, and this is declassified, so you can look this up as well, all very public. Proposed false flag operation planned by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, aimed at creating a pretext for military intervention in Cuba. And again, this contributes to democide. This contributes to a lot of death. The plan involves staging various acts of violence and terrorism, including hijacking planes, sinking boats with Cuban refugees, orchestrating terrorist attacks in U.S. cities, and even potentially killing American citizens. I mean, my gosh, right? These actions would be falsely attributed to Cuba to generate public and international support for a war against the Castro regime. So introducing, again, these people to say, well, if let's do this bad thing, and then out of that bad thing may come something good. And so it's like a justification. And so it remained classified for nearly 4 decades until it was revealed in 2001. And ask yourself, what is classified to this day that we still don't really know about? And then what does that do when there's information that's kept hidden from people? Wouldn't you expect there to be so-called conspiracy theorists and people who question things? Because they're in an environment, as Stephanie says, that prompts them to have that distrust, prompts them to want to ask those questions because nobody's giving them answers. They feel like nobody is giving them the answers that they want. And so in medicine, it's like, is your client, is the patient feeling like they're getting receptive, like feedback from their provider? Do they feel like they're connected with them or they understand them? And this one directly affects health. Government alcohol poisoning in the 1920s to around 1933, the federal government in the United States, again, free country on earth, implemented a controversial program to deter the consumption of illicit alcohol by mandating the addition of toxic substances to industrial alcohols, which were often stolen and converted into drinkable spirits by bootleggers. This initiative, sometimes referred to as the Chemist's War, involved adding poisonous chemicals such as methyl alcohol and other denaturants to industrial alcohol supplies. The government's intent was to discourage people from drinking illegally produced alcohol, but the program had deadly consequences. By some estimates, at least 10,000 people died from consuming this poisoned alcohol before the prohibition ended in 1933. So all this over a righteous cause, right? Like, oh, we want people to be healthy and alcohol free. So let's use law, let's use the systems that we have created to tell people what to do with their own body, and with their own medical choices and food choices. This affects people's health quite a bit.
A side note on this issue of the prohibition, there were alcohol stills on many farms where the farmers were creating their own energy source through the use of alcohol as a fuel, and that the prohibition also served to what's the word, to disallow, and make illegal those stills on the private property, so that it also affected the farmers' independence as well, and their ability to create their own energy. So again, creating a dependency on the energy sources of the state.
Mm.
Seems like the state likes to play God a little too much.
Yeah, well, we might be playing God, right? And not realizing it. And through the Hegelian dialectic, being a part of that agenda, not realizing it. And little do we know, we are telling others how to live their own lives. These are average people carrying out these orders. They're not gods, right? So what is going on here? What's causing an individual to do such a thing? This is where we talk about statism. And here you have the Manhattan Project, a top secret U.S. government program initiated in 1942 to develop the world's first atomic bombs in World War II. And so, led by the United States in collaboration with the United Kingdom and Canada, the project employed nearly 130,000 people at its peak and cost about $2 billion, equivalent to around $27 billion in 2023. The project involved research and production at over 30 sites across North America. The project culminated in the Trinity test in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, followed by the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. So the existence of this project was kept secret from the public until after these bombings. I mean, goodness. So we bomb an entire population, and we don't tell our own public about this. This is top secret among certain people who are order following. Keep this closed, keep this top secret, so we can put an end to a war. Justification here to create more evil, right? And we have to get down to the roots. Like, why did World War II happen here? And why did we do this bomb that now feared the entire world? Like, oh my gosh, we're going to get into a nuclear war. And now people still have concerns about that to this day. And if you have tons of people who aren't really thinking for themselves, I mean, what might happen, right? When it comes to medicine on a large scale, or war on a large scale, and all these different things that people fear on a large scale. Artificial intelligence on a large scale. Can it happen without a bunch of people turning off their conscience? Well, here is another one that goes directly into medicine. The Nazi delousing camps. The Nazis exploited public health concerns, particularly the fear of typhus epidemics, as a pretext for isolating and persecuting targeted groups. Under the guise of disease prevention and delousing procedures, they implemented increasingly brutal and inhumane measures in ghettos and concentration camps. Delousing rituals, including head shavings and exposure to Zyklon B gas, originally used as a pesticide, became part of the systematic process of genocide, right? So Nazi doctors and officials used the language of public health and hygiene to justify quarantine, ghettoization, and ultimately mass murder. In reality, the deplorable conditions in ghettos and camps deliberately maintained by the Nazis led to the spread of disease, which was then used to further vilify inmates as carriers of contagion. This is getting now awfully a little bit close, isn't it, to some recent events? Let's talk then about some of the problems that are prompting people to these mindsets, aside from just looking at psychology, because clearly we know that there's a lot of money involved here in potential insurance companies that get people to do these types of atrocious acts. We have a big problem with money. Who has access to what treatments? There is a divide in those who have access to or money for certain treatments and those who don't. Many people don't have financial access to different interventions or preventative measures. For example, neurofeedback, organic food, chiropractics, functional medicine, quality nutritional supplements, holistic coaching and counseling, and SPECT scans, etc. The healthcare model, as we mentioned, has become quite a business. At least in our view, it's become where patients have become consumers, not too sick, not too healthy, but dependent. They are not given all their options and they may be lacking knowledge. And so the question comes to us, well, where does the state play a role in this, right? We mentioned many examples in history where medicine was merged here with using the state and using law, having a lot of lobbying toward congressmen, toward practitioners to push certain drugs, to push certain things on people. Well, without statism, without that order following mentality, the market can provide competition, right? Those alternative solutions can moreover flourish because there's supply and demand. Many people could be ready for options that are being withheld. Currently, there's a lot of agencies in America that withhold certain medicines overseas from coming into the country. And it's not only that, it's happening on an individual level, right? Where the doctors don't know about the alternative treatments, they're not taught about it. So it's sort of ingrained on all different layers. People are also overworked and may not have time to invest in themselves. It can prevent us from emotional hygiene, and that could be quite important. The problems concerning money create a hyperfixation on the material for solutions without any introspection on the origin of the problem. This is also an imbalance toward the masculine and the mental that we talked about before.
I think that the dynamic that occurs between like brand name drugs and generic drugs fits into this idea of business and how it gets really convoluted in the care of patients. I have, some examples currently with people who have been taking a medicine that is like a brand name medicine and it's working fine for them. But all of a sudden the access is limited and generics are being, brought in. Or for example, the rules say that you have to go through X number of interventions before you can get the medicine that is a brand name. And there's a block to access to get that. And oftentimes patients go through a lot of failure in their efforts to resolve the problem because they have to jump the hoops. And the doctors have to write all these TARs and, justify it every step of the way, that they did all these other things. But what I've also found out that's super interesting is that the generics, while they're kind of marketed as equivalent, they're not necessarily the same, and that there are a lot of additives in those medicines that can lead to side effects that are different from, the brand name medicine, for example, and that they may not be as effective and they may wreak some havoc in a person's life. And also, a lot of the manufacturing is done overseas and with different types of monitoring and safety protocols. And so you're more likely to get something that you didn't actually ask for. So there's a lot of these complications that happen because of the business aspect and the barriers that then the medical system seems to take on, or the insurance companies. It's mostly, I think, in the matter of the insurance companies, where they're demanding that people try other things before they'll pay for the more expensive drug.
Yeah. And remember that trifecta, we got patient, provider, and then system, right? So is the health insurance market, as you just mentioned, is it really a free market? Well, here we have a teacher, Anton Beatty, who shares with us that government regulations also prohibit people from buying insurance from companies that are headquartered out of states that have a different set of regulations. This is an obvious barrier to entry, which decreases the supply of competing insurance companies and thus raises the price. As I noted before, each state determines the provisions that insurance companies must abide by. This means that the regulators essentially grant monopolies in each state, since insurance licenses must go through them. The barriers to entry in the health insurance market are thus appalling. So when you're mixing this order following violence that comes from the state, from that right to rule that we mentioned, that type of authority that is very direct, mixing that with this insurance company that people look up to as also a lesser authority, not based on violence, you start getting really complicated scenarios here where people are just like, I just, where is my health? It's like I'm dealing with all these systems over my health, but where is my health? Where's the healing taking place?
It's all the barriers and hoops to jump that really exacerbate people and often lead vulnerable people to feel very uncared for as an individual. That they're suffering, they're allowed to suffer, they're made to suffer in a way because of these rules before they can actually get the very thing that can give them relief, which they know from the beginning if it could just have occurred first, right? Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people who can relate to this experience.
And he goes on paying for what you don't want. In some states, people who don't drink alcohol must purchase coverage for alcoholism. Non-smokers must purchase coverage for anti-smoking programs. Non-drug users must purchase coverage for drug abuse treatment, etc. Some states require consumers to purchase 50 or more types of mandated coverage. Special interest groups are mainly behind these acts of legislation, which come from people in certain fields who want to expand the market for their services. So again, they go in with an agenda and they're using that and not really thinking about people's health, right? And if we're not aware of that because we are just going with the way things are as the system and it's part of the process, we're not emphasizing that individual sovereignty, which is perhaps where people's true healing takes place, where all these external things won't affect us as much if we really have that internal locus of control that we mentioned before.
I just encourage anyone who's watching this, who is in the system in any capacity, whether it be you're an insurance agent or an administrator or a provider or even a patient, share with us what you're experiencing as well. I mean, this is our aggregated information, but if you have details and things that are important to make aware of for the public, please share where what we're not seeing and what you're seeing as well.
Yes, please. And here you have from Chris Brown and Julian Adorni. In the spirit of competition, self-interested entrepreneurs will strive to serve the consumer better than their rivals. This will result in more affordable healthcare for more people, something that government could never achieve, regardless of any mixture of force, money, and bureaucracy. In fact, any government intervention will only stifle this healthy process. And they used actually in their writings Walmart as an example of selling pharmaceutical products. And even I can say in Florida, when there was a lot of things happening with like floods and different natural disasters, you had a lot of companies stepping up to the plate saying like, we'll help people because we want, our consumers to be well, or simply because we have the money to do so. And a lot of the government agencies were actually discouraged from helping people because they were not actually helping people at that time. And so the United States healthcare system is one of the most regulated sectors of the economy and was so even before Obamacare. This has predictably driven up costs. Instead of another complicated insurance scheme, let's give freedom a try. So this is what they're saying here. Very interesting to see from people from an economic, healthcare, insurance perspective saying, well, what if we just give freedom a try? Now, what if we emphasize that individual sovereignty to make their own decisions with different businesses and organizations of all different kinds, all competing for whatever product they have to serve?
This reminds me of a trend I've been seeing in concierge healthcare. And in a way, it only highlights the division of economics, right? The haves and the have-nots. And it's an idea that if you have money and you want to pay extra, pay your doctor an additional amount of money, that you're going to get better care, that doctor is going to be answering their phones and calling you back. They're going to be spending additional time solving your problem, maybe even a home visit or an extra visit on the fly, right? So that you get better treatment when you're paying more. And again, this I think creates a divisiveness. And in some ways, I've asked myself, isn't this concierge care what everyone deserves?
Right.
And why is it that money is the dividing factor?
Yeah.
Leslie, I saw a lot of that as well when certain providers were really truly starting to wake up within the limitations within the system. there was a jumping out of the system and not really any soft landing. But you're right. It's like, well, the answer is to create my own private practice. I don't want to be associated with the system. So then I will create a new model of private practice called concierge practice. And I've looked into numerous concierge practices around, and sadly, the class system fully is existing within that model. And again, it just highlights for the providers of to question within themselves, where really is your mind? Is it just about your pain within the system and you finding a way to just make your money in a way that you're not in pain from the system's suppression? Or is it that you're still in line with your calling and care to all of humanity? So maybe encouraging people watching this who are connected with or own concierge practices to at least have some sort of a program for people maybe who are on Medicare or experiencing chronic illness. Try to integrate something as best as you can. Don't just think, let me save myself from the system and then even make it harder for the patients continuing forward. Have both ends in mind.
I love that point, Stephanie. I think that's very fair.
Yeah, and we mentioned these different concepts before, like, we talked about scientism, perhaps collectivism. So if we're bringing a lot of this together in relationship to economics, here we have Edmund Bradley, a former banker, sharing with us, he says, how damaging government interference is. Once a given hypothesis has been accepted as received wisdom by the government, researchers with alternative hypotheses might not only find it difficult to get funding for their research, they can find themselves unable even to find a job and teach classes. They can be blackballed by the other professors in their field who don't challenge the received wisdom. So again, is this really freedom in the healthcare system itself? Is this really a healthy model in the healthcare system itself?
There are providers realizing and scientists realizing how actually the research material, as in this slide, could be incentivized in the wrong direction. And there's a lot happening at this very moment about bringing this to conscious awareness. So hopefully we continue in the right direction.
Yeah, and we're going to be sharing a lot of different models that have been proposed out of this perhaps failed healthcare model. So we can see, yeah, there are alternatives and viable options that are being implemented today. And that's why people are stepping down and becoming more courageous to do so, right? So the problems with the research material that we can see that is ongoing is that there's funding bias, right? There's publication bias, there's replication crisis, there's a pressure to publish, and there's conflicts of interest. There's an ongoing debate about how funding sources might influence research outcomes, particularly in industry-sponsored studies. Studies with positive results are more likely to be published, which can skew the overall body of research. Many scientific fields are grappling with issues of reproducibility in research findings. The publish or perish culture in academia can sometimes lead to rushed or lower quality research. And then researchers' financial ties to industry, as we also mentioned before, can potentially influence study design or interpretation of results. So for me, again, looking at this, it's like emphasizing the individual to make their own choices and take control of their health, because there's so many external factors and systems that are interfering, trying to make it hard on the individual if they're always outsourcing, if they're always looking outward for those solutions. It's like, who do you trust? What system do you go with? And yes, we can build perhaps a system of trust, right? But maybe it's one that includes the individual more. Maybe it's one that includes more of that internal locus of control, that feminine that we are, not really having enough of, as we identified.
There's a lack of transparency happening. And I think that the public is starting to have their own clarion call that actually we want to know what's going on. We want to know the truth. How are you being trained? How are you taught to care for me as a patient? I've heard many providers say that actually in med school, and I did not go to med school, but I've had firsthand knowledge of people saying, oh yeah, the proxy parent role is very common. We're taught that sometimes that's how we have to be with our patients. I think the call is it's monumental, because there's a call for sovereignty and patients taking more full responsibility for their health and wellness. And this is very opposite of what the current model has been thriving off of. And there are some people that still want to be a part of that old model and not take full responsibility for their health and outsource their health and wellness towards a system. But there is a growing, formidable bunch of humanity that doesn't want that anymore. And I think we're in the midst of this battle between patients wanting to claim their sovereignty and having a non-hierarchical relationship as much with their provider, more of a physician guide, honoring their expertise while really letting the patient drive their own health and wellness plan, with the old model. But everybody within the current healthcare model has only been trained in the old model.
It's just like
So-
Buckminster Fuller said, right? To get rid of that old model, let's introduce a new model that shows better.
I've been encouraging this to a lot of providers on social media platforms. Instead of continuously talking about the negativity that's occurring, I said, look, we all know to a degree what's occurring. Let's put some of our heads together to start create another model, another separate model besides concierge practice that really is suitable for the general public.
I wanted to highlight this, the problem of interpretation of results, which also is added to the difficult access to the research and the confusion that an average person might be in, even trying to interpret or read the research papers, because there is a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of medicalized language, which does create some distance. You have to almost be trained in the language to be able to read and understand it. And it's very time consuming. And I know, Steph, you've even mentioned, as you've been going into studying research data yourself, that it's very hard to even find the pathway to a lot of the studies. And so the general public is going to be listening to a authority figure at the head of a organization, a health organization, and trusting that they're interpreting the data or the results of a research study accurately, that they're being honest. And what we found over the last few years is that sometimes the recommendations and interpretations of these people in power are absolutely inconsistent and incongruent with the actual study itself. And that there's sort of a blatant bias or a leaning towards maybe, again, using a certain drug, for a problem that has very questionable research backing, but yet saying that it does, right? So brings back this whole concept of personal responsibility for the things you put in your body and the people you trust. And we're, sadly, I know this is kind of like blowing up a lot of people's worlds in a sense. And I think it's a necessary process in order to get to the place of a better solution.
Yeah, I'd like to add, Leslie, to what you're saying is you talked about the complexity of medical terminology and the information that's put in the research papers that the majority of the general public would not be able to truly understand and maybe comprehend correctly. And if we're in America, if we're speaking English, I don't understand if we are claiming to be transparent and in lieu of true care. Why would we complexify something to the degree where it was a privileged resource for an individual in a particular system? You can just feel the drippings of ego within that model. If anybody was a good, honest healthcare provider, they would be really good at translating that complex information to where a person in the general public, for the most part, could comprehend in a degree where it wasn't exclusive. The whole system is set up based off of exclusive academic expertise, languaging the model. And if we truly care, if we're speaking the same language, would we proselytize that model that says only I can have access to this information about your body and health? General public health. That just it is just an egoic model. It doesn't need to be that complex. The language doesn't need to be heightened on the intellectual level at every single turning. I mean, to me, I just feel like it's a waste of time in education. We don't need to complexify things and to continue to complexify things, which sadly, and I understand this, is a lot of academics love that. They love the ability to complexify things because it makes them feel good about what they're doing and, makes them to be seen and heard within their community. They feel special, they feel smart. But really, is that in service of what we claim we're in service of, which is the care of patients? Doesn't make sense.
And we have a lot, we're foreshadowing a lot here as we go on, so we can share as we move on a lot of the deeper aspects. Like we're going to go into some examples of what you mean by that, the complexification, the terminology. And that way we really break it down. You get a holistic picture of what is going on right now within the system so we can best be able to treat it, from a holistic point of view and from a preventative point of view, where we can try to move toward that better system, showing it by action, showing it by example. And I thank you, everybody, for joining me for this part. Join us for our next part so we can dive deeper into those new models that we perhaps need to create at this point.
Low-level offenders, jaywalkers. Cameras record them going through intersections, zero in on their face, and then publicly shame them on nearby video screens. It's all part of the Chinese government's new social credit system, where people's daily behavior is monitored and rated. But this social credit rating goes far beyond a traditional credit score, which is based on your finances. China's version factors in everything from jaywalking to smoking on trains to buying too many video games. If your score gets too low, you can be banned from buying plane tickets, renting a house, or getting a loan.
You can tell whether it is an adult, a child, a male or female.
Police in Beijing have been wearing these glasses that can recognize faces linked to the government's national database to help boost arrests.
Do you trust the government the way they're using
your technology. Sorry, I can't answer this.
Anyone who tests positive has no choice. At night, between the high rises, a drone tells people to follow COVID rules and, bizarrely, not to sing on their balconies. Crowd shouts, "We're starving." Well, last week a man was filmed venting his fury on the phone. "What am I supposed to buy?" he shouts. "What do I eat? You're driving us to our deaths."
The paper is blank, but the eyes say it all, filled with rage.
If you look at the Chinese system now, they have this QR code. You can't do anything in China now. And China is the blueprint. I've been saying it for so long. And look what's happened since the COVID era. That China's moved to the West in terms of the way society is orchestrated and organized. If you haven't got the right ticks on your QR code, then there's more and more and more and more and more things that you cannot do. You cannot take part in mainstream society in China. In China, in the hazmat suits and police uniforms coming out in their stupid tanks, what are they doing? Who are they? They are of the very people, and from the very people they are enslaving. So you've got the hierarchy in China, and they're recruiting from the population, the target population, people to enforce the will of the tiny few upon the population. And so you look at the gathering slavery of the population around the world, in the West, etc. And it's being imposed by people in uniform who have children and grandchildren and families who are subject to the same fascism that they are imposing on the population. Freedom!